All right. That's great. Thank you very much. My name is James Pepper. I'm the chair of the Vermont Cannabis Control Board, and I call this meeting of the Act 65 Working Group to order. Before we get started, I would like to approve the minutes from our last meeting. And I think because this is technically just a special meeting of the Cannabis Control Board, that it's just the three board members of the Cannabis Control Board that need to approve those minutes. But I will put the draft minutes into the chat. So, Julie and Kyle, if you've joined, are you able to, oh, there you are, Kyle. Are you able to review the minutes and is there a motion to approve them?
I was able to review them, although I do not see Julie as being with us yet. Is she off camera somewhere?
Okay. Well, Kyle, I think we can do this together then.
That works. Motion to approve the minutes is drafted.
And I'll second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And of course, there is a video recording posted to our YouTube for anyone that wants to kind of see the real-time meeting as it played out. But anyway, let me move on. Just a few administrative details. I guess I should pull up my PowerPoint quickly. Second. Sorry about this.
I can go ahead and get the draft minutes into the chat for everybody else. How about that?
Great. Okay. So just wanted to remind everyone that this is a public meeting that is being recorded, and the recording is a public document. It will kind of live on our YouTube page for the indefinite future. Please, everyone who's joined, keep that in mind when you're commenting. We know that there are a number of patient and caregivers joining us today. If you do have any personal privacy concerns and do not want to be recorded, you do have a couple of options. If you've joined by video, you can turn off your camera and you can change the name that appears on the screen by editing your profile. I have a few just very kind of basic, guides to how to change your name. You can also exit out of the meeting altogether and watch the recording on YouTube on your own time, and submit input to the board through our website. This meeting is scheduled for 2 hours. We have quite a bit of content to get through. My plan is to present information that's relevant to the specific topics that are outlined in Act 65 and then pause at various points for comments, questions, and feedback. We'll do our best to give each identified group of stakeholders equal time. We will strive to let people talk as long as they want, and make repeat comments if they would like to, but I will try and prioritize first-time commenters over people who have already commented. The first meeting ran over the 2 hours by about 30 minutes. I personally don't mind sticking around at the end of the meeting for additional comment, but if we are running behind schedule during the planned agenda, I will use my discretion to limit multiple comments or impose a time limit. As always, please be respectful. Very little utility to the CCB in participants engaging in a back and forth with people they don't agree with. At the first meeting, we reviewed the charges of Act 65. We looked at the history of the medical program, including some of the structural challenges it's facing currently. And then we talked about a path forward for the next few meetings. Today, we're going to focus on some of the specific directives that the legislature asked us to look at. But before we get into that, I wanted to, let me see, I think I should probably introduce everyone to the kind of folks that are around the table, in both in our room and some of the people from the study committee. So why don't I just stop sharing for 1 second? And Dr. McLean, you're the representative from the Vermont Academic Detailing Society. Would you mind just kind of saying hello and waving for everyone?
Hi there.
Hi there.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. I'd like to introduce the members of the CCB team. We have 4 staff that serve the medical program. I can see Isabel Center, who recently started with us, Priya Holland. If you guys wouldn't mind just waving for the camera. Thank you. And we also have our director of licensing is Kimberly Lashua. Kimberly, I don't know if you want to say hello. And then our deputy licensing director is Melissa Anderson. I don't know if you're with us. And then the members of the CCB, Kyle, I can see you. Would you mind just waving for the camera? And then I believe we're being joined by Julie Holberd, and she is our other board member. The other members of the study committee are the representatives from the 3 medical dispensaries, and then also medical professionals that are interested in this program, and then patients and caregivers. And, we just kind of opened it up to any medical professionals or patients or caregivers that wanted to attend. So I'm not going to go through all kind of 28 people that have joined, but I think the kind of majority of the rest of the folks would fall into one of those 3 categories. So let me just go back to sharing. Sorry.
And Pepper, just for the folks watching and listening, I did say I was going to put the meeting minutes from last meeting in the chat, but our chat function is off. That's one of our etiquette procedures to make sure we can properly monitor the comments that are coming in and out of the meeting. So what we're going to do is Nellie's going to, in follow-up to this meeting, email everybody who's on that list the meeting minutes from last meeting.
Great. Okay. So I think that kind of gets us through the very basics. I did want to kind of refresh everyone's recollection as to what Act 65, is and kind of what we're doing here. For anyone who was following the progress of Act 65, it was H270 when it was still in a bill form. You'll remember that this bill contained a number of changes to the medical program, including the addition of a handful of new qualifying conditions that would qualify a patient for the medical program. The committees of jurisdiction did not have sufficient time to parse through the testimony on these conditions, so they removed that section and replaced it with the reporting requirement that's in Section 21 that's up on the screen. There are a couple of key points here that I'd like to highlight. First, that the end goal of this process is not a consensus report from the named stakeholders. Everyone who is named has a special interest in the outcome, and your perspective is invaluable to the board. But I don't have any illusions that we're all going to kind of agree on what these final recommendations are going to be. The end product really is going to be what the CCB believes are the most important recommendations on each of these topics as informed by this process. Hopefully our recommendations will be incorporated into a piece of legislation. And anyone who disagrees with what we ultimately propose will have an opportunity to share your thoughts with the relevant committees through the traditional legislative channels. Second, some of these charges that the legislature asks us to look at, I don't believe are going to lead to recommendations. Number 2 is something that we all identified as something that just is not probably worth a lot of our time and attention. Third, we're going to meet 4 times before we submit a final recommendation. That's going to come on or before January 15th, 2024. We're trying to accommodate as many people as we possibly can in scheduling, but, especially for our next meeting, I intend on calling a few expert witnesses that live out west. So the next one may have to be a little bit later in the day, but we will try to accommodate everyone. And with that, I think I'm going to just move into the substance. So today I want to start with the illnesses and symptoms most appropriately treated by cannabis. Because this report was a substitute amendment for a proposal to expand the qualifying conditions list, I think it's important to think critically about the concept of qualifying conditions. As with everything cannabis related, we have to start with the Controlled Substance Act. I know this is a review of our last meeting, but cannabis is listed as a Schedule I controlled substance, meaning that the federal government has determined cannabis has a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical uses. The practical impact of this designation is that there are many regulatory and practical barriers to legally obtaining or possessing cannabis, let alone conducting basic clinical and population health research on cannabis and cannabinoids. At a future meeting, I think there may be some value in developing the record on the reasons why the traditional regulatory pathways to drug approval are specifically challenging for cannabis. However, despite all these barriers, we have seen the FDA approve a handful of cannabis-derived drug products. We have Epidiolex, which is concentrated cannabidiol, and it's used for the treatment of seizures. And we have three synthetic THC products, Marinol, Syndrose. These are for kind of nausea associated with chemotherapy. And then Sesamet, which is, again, usually used for nausea. As we mentioned last time, there are 38 states that have some form of a medical program. As more and more states bring these programs online, there is growing pressure to look at the potential therapeutic effects of certain cannabinoids, either kind of in isolation or in combination, and how they may be helpful for certain specific conditions. We're looking here at a slide from a 2017 report from the National Academics of Sciences that compiled at that point all the studies on the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids in relation to certain conditions. So there's kind of conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis or their cannabinoids are effective for chronic pain, antiemetics, nausea and vomiting, and then some evidence that they're good for MS, certain aspects of MS. There's less but still moderate evidence around kind of sleep outcomes, and then there's limited evidence that they're effective for increasing appetite, for people with HIV or AIDS, MS again, Tourette syndrome, and others. So this is, a relatively old study at this point, but I think it is a good kind of marker as to where the science is. This is a 2018 report. It shows a very similar data set in a slightly different form and includes the types and levels of evidence for each of the conditions. So, there's a growing body of research, whether that be clinical, preclinical, or behavioral studies that are being conducted in the US and internationally that's been informing the decision making on qualifying conditions in the 38 medical use states. We at the board thought it might be useful to put together a graph of the most common qualifying conditions in the various states. This is probably hard to read, but I thought, at least looking at kind of some of the most common conditions might be useful. I did want to mention a few caveats about this graph. One, for the sake of fitting it all into one slide, I cut off all of the qualifying conditions that only appear in a single state. Two, certain states use different terminology for similar conditions. So I didn't try to combine them all because I'm sure there are kind of medical differences or diagnostic differences between them, but there's probably some overlap here. And then three, some states, instead of listing specific conditions, have catch-all phrases like any severe or debilitating condition that a physician believes could be treated by cannabis. So these numbers shouldn't be taken as gospel, but they are, I think, instructive as to kind of some of the more common conditions that go beyond maybe what those two research studies that I showed earlier. This next slide presents similar information in a slightly different way. Here you can just see kind of the most common conditions. The ones that have a star next to them are ones that are included in the Vermont qualifying conditions list. So in addition to just, what is a qualifying condition, there are some kind of unique approaches that we've seen in the various states. Some states, allow for kind of a non-legislative approval process. Either it's the cannabis agency, the cannabis board, the kind of the parent, organization. Some like Minnesota, the cannabis commission is housed within the Department of Health, and sometimes that the parent agency gets to make decisions about adding new qualifying conditions. And then some have kind of outsourced it to a third party board of experts, and I'll have some examples of that in a later slide. And then, some people, as I mentioned before, allow the kind of healthcare physician, the qualifying provider, to make a call. Some of them have kind of a standard by which they have to, assess a patient before they can recommend cannabis for that person. But, you see at least 11 states that have a process where it's really up to the kind of bona fide healthcare provider, the treating clinician, to decide whether cannabis would be an appropriate treatment for that patient. And then one that's kind of emerged recently is that, I think we saw that chronic pain has been kind of scientifically shown, or there's at least clinical trials to show that chronic pain can be appropriately treated by cannabis or cannabinoids. And so I think a lot of states have started to move in response to the opioid crisis to recommending cannabis as an alternative to an opioid, or for people that are experiencing substance use disorder. So there's 7 states or territories that have that as a qualifying condition. So one of the, okay, so then I just wanted to dig into this notion of a little bit deeper to an agency, department, or a non-legislative approval process. In talking to kind of some of the stakeholders, I think in a lot of the folks that have been involved with the medical program over the years, adding new qualifying conditions through a legislative process can be a little bit challenging, mostly because the legislature is hearing, hundreds of bills every year. There's very limited committee time, and there's very limited opportunity for the people on the committees to dig into the science and to understand it and to make evidence-based determinations. And so, there's been this trend in a number of states to move the approval process for new qualifying conditions outside of the legislative process. There's a number of different approaches. I've just cataloged a few here. Some use, I'm looking at the deciding entity, and I don't know if that's the right terminology, but again, some use the cannabis board or agency or its parent agency, again, Minnesota, and we're going to do a deep dive into Minnesota in a second. But their commissioner of health gets to decide. Some have appointed, again, a board of physicians in Connecticut. It's all medical doctors. The compassionate use board in Utah is all medical doctors. These are just two examples. There's others. So a new qualifying condition can come either from a petition of a healthcare provider in some states. It can come from a petition from a single prospective patient, or it can come kind of sua sponte from the board itself. A board can, in its own regard, add a qualifying condition. Some boards have established kind of a standard of review that has to be met in order to add a qualifying condition. In Maryland, their medical commission can add a new condition so long as it's debilitating and that the medical condition can reasonably expect to be relieved by cannabis and that other medical treatments have been proven ineffective. So they have to kind of have a 3-part test before they can add a new condition. Arizona, has a different standard. They're all relatively similar, but some of them are more prescriptive than others. And then some, the legislature, in Vermont has historically not been willing to kind of hand this responsibility off. And I assume that's true of other states. And so some, when the board, whichever deciding entity decides to approve a new condition, it triggers an administrative rulemaking process, which then gives the legislature a second look, the ability to kind of have one last veto over adding that new condition. And I should say that qualifying conditions, a legislature, even if a board were to adopt one in one of these various states, legislature could always come back in a subsequent session and decide to remove it if they wanted to. So with that, one model that I found particularly compelling in kind of adopting emerging science when it comes to qualifying conditions, is Minnesota. And the Office of Medical Marijuana in Minnesota, again, is housed within the Department of Health. It has a research division. I invited the director of the research division here today. I made him wake up early and, forced him to listen to me talk. And I think what I would like to do, David, if you're willing, is to talk us through the Minnesota model, which I think really, both in its kind of design and the outcomes, has kind of led the way. And I just mentioned that in that slide, which I just took off, that you're the director of research for the Minnesota Cannabis Commission, and you have an MPH, and you also had the distinct honor of co-chairing, or maybe even chairing on your own, our Cannabis Regulators Association medical subcommittee. So he's been leading the way for kind of the country on developing developing our medical programs. So if you don't mind, I'll just turn things over to you to help us kind of understand how Minnesota does things.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me, James. Good morning, everybody. I should say, too, I was a co-chair of that CANRA committee with Owen, who was from Iowa. So we had a Midwest contingent leading that group for the first year. And just for a little background, so as James said, I'm the manager of our research unit. The research unit is me and one other person right now. So it's not a very large unit. I have a data analyst who's extremely talented, and she's been with the program since the start back in 2015. Fortunately, by the end of the year, I will be adding another research analyst and an epidemiologist to our staff as well. So give me just a minute to share my screen here. Let's see. Oh, I don't know which screen I'm sharing. Oh, of course, it doesn't work exactly how you want it to work. Here we go. There. There you go. You should see my first slide. Is that correct?
Yep, there it
Okay.
is.
Great. So here we go. And James, please help me because I could talk about our program for hours and I don't want to put anyone through that. So feel free to usher me through any areas that are of not interest to the group.
Absolutely. And when we get through the slides, I'll try and keep things on topic, but when we get through the slides, I'd like to pause and ask our stakeholders that have joined us today if they have questions for you, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, yeah, not a problem at all. So I'm just going to talk about our medical program, just to give a background about it, just so kind of people have a standing, because as you may know, it's like every state is just a little bit different. There's no program that seems to be consistent across all the states. I'll talk about our petition process and some of the lessons we learned from that. And then, if interested, I could talk about some of our PTSD findings because we've had PTSD as a qualifying condition for a couple of years now, and then any questions you may have. So in Minnesota, we've had our state medical program was started through legislation, and that passed in 2014. And we had a year to put our program together. So patients first started coming into our program in July of 2015. In that first year, we had fewer than 1,000 patients were part of it, but today we're up to 40,000 patients. And then, interestingly enough, just this past year, we passed adult recreational use, and we're kind of in an in-between stage in that it is legal right now to possess and consume cannabis. And prior to now, we haven't had homegrown allowed even in the medical program, and that is now allowed in the state. And our tribal nations, we have 11 different tribal nations in the state. And since they're their own nation state, they have their own rules. And so they actually have dispensaries now that are selling to anyone in the state. And there are only two, and they in rural parts of Minnesota. But the state will also have then dispensaries throughout the state starting in 2025. So when our program began, the legislation that was passed included 9 different qualifying medical conditions, and those were cancer, glaucoma, HIV/AIDS, Tourette syndrome, ALS, seizures, muscle spasms, IBD, and terminal illness. And then after that initial list, we've added through a petition process additional conditions. So now we're up from 9, we're up to 19. And so in 2016, we added intractable pain. In 2017, PTSD. 2018, autism and sleep apnea. In 2019, we added Alzheimer's disease. In 2020, we added chronic pain. And chronic pain was, our program was growing year after year, pretty well. But with the addition of chronic pain, we saw a real jump in the number of patients in our program. In 2021, then we added sickle cell disease and vocal and motor tic disorder. And then just this past year, August 1st, we added OCD and irritable bowel syndrome. When you look at our program, you can see that almost 60% of our patients are qualified under the condition of chronic pain, and almost a third have PTSD. After that, you can see that the number of patients for these other conditions drops off fairly dramatically. To the bottom four here, which are fairly new, recent additions to our program, there's less than 100 people in each of those different categories. This is a map of Minnesota, and I just want to express that we have patients from all across the state, and these represent the different counties in Minnesota. The dark blue indicates, more patients, and that is that includes Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the metro area around Minneapolis and St. Paul. And there is a couple of large cities in other portions of the state, but for the most part, especially when you get up to northern Minnesota and western Minnesota, it's pretty rural. But even those rural counties have patients in our program. So just a few more details about us. We originally started out where only extracted products were allowed, but in 2022, then we added gummies and raw cannabis, combustible flower, so people could start to smoke it. And that also was through a petition process that those modes of were added to our program. Another thing about our state is we have pharmacists at all of our dispensaries, and they consult for dosage and product recommendations for our patients. We are limited to 2 vertically integrated manufacturers. I'm not sure what it's like in your state, but in Minnesota, it was designed from the start that we would only have 2 vertically integrated manufacturers. And that means that the manufacturer cultivates the plants, they produce the products, and then they also have the dispensaries. And like I said, at all those dispensaries, we have a pharmacist. Currently, we have 15 different dispensaries across the state. And those, they're not all concentrated right in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area. They are spread across the state to a certain degree. And then we also have a commitment to learning from our experience. So that means that we offer optional surveys that our patients can take for us. We gather data from that, but there's also a mandatory survey that patients take every time they go to a dispensary. They have to fill out a form, and that form includes information for our pharmacists, such as what their medical conditions are, beyond the qualifying condition, as well as what medications they're taking. So the pharmacist can look for drug-to-drug interactions. But we also ask some questions about like some of the benefits that they're seeing, as well as some of the negative or side effects that they have. For our healthcare practitioners, they have to be, who are part of our program and who can qualify patients into the program, they have to be licensed in Minnesota, and they're a doctor of medicine or a physician assistant or an advanced practice registered nurse. The participation for our healthcare practitioners is completely voluntary. Their main roles are to certify the qualifying condition. Excuse me. And originally, that had to be an in-person visit, but that changed just recently to where that first visit can actually be via telemedicine. One of the things that they sign off on is that they are going to provide ongoing treatment to their patients. And I have to say, we don't check up on that. We don't dictate what that looks like, but it's kind of like the expectation is general ongoing treatment as they would define it. And then we also have ability to access patient records, and that's the healthcare practitioners have to agree to that. To be honest, we haven't asked for any of those records. We kind of feel like it's really none of our business unless there is some type of need. If there's some type of an investigation that fraud might be involved or something like that, that's a case where we might request it, but we haven't thus far, and it's not something that we plan to do in the future. And currently, our patients have to be recertified by their healthcare practitioners every year. Fortunately, in the last legislative session, that has changed so that in 2025, it's going to be a 3-year certification process. And, you know, James, if people want to ask questions, they can definitely ask questions as I'm going, if you're okay with that, or if you prefer that they wait till the end. It kind of doesn't matter.
Yeah, it might be helpful just to wait till the end of the presentation. If people could just keep track of any parts of the presentation that you want to ask questions about, you know, as soon as David's finished, we'll open it up to questions. It's just, you know, with, you know, however many people, 30 people, it could get a little.
Okay, so I'll just continue. So here's our petition process that we have. So we open petitions to the public for 2 months of the year, June and July. And this is where they can petition to add a qualifying medical condition or a delivery method. And that's where we added our gummies and raw flour. That we usually don't get very many delivery method petitions. They're the qualifying medical conditions that we get petitions for. A review panel, and so as part of looking at those petitions, we have a review panel that was set up. And this was set up via legislation. And it was set up so, and this was a year after we got the program going. And it's set up so that the health commissioner is the person who makes the decision about what conditions to add. And I'll go into timing a little bit later. But basically, the health commissioner has to present forward what their recommendation is, what conditions they want to include in the next year. And so that goes before the health and public safety subcommittees. And what happens is that subcommittee, they don't, like, legislation doesn't vote on anything. It's the decision of the health commissioner. But during that window that our legislation is in, is happening, they can have influence on the commissioner of health, or they can kind of make cases as to whether they agree with what the commissioner has proposed or not. And I can talk about one instance where there was a change in the commissioner's decision. But also, as part of this legislation, we set up a 7-member review panel, and that includes a patient or a patient advocate, 1 healthcare practitioner, 1 pediatric healthcare practitioner, and then 4 at-large members. And our members serve a 3-year term, but they can serve more than 1 term, and many of our members have served more than 1 term. So when the public submits a petition, we do it from our website, so it's an electronic petition. And what's included in there is they indicate what medical condition they want to add, the symptoms of the conditions and the treatments for it, the availability of conventional current therapies, what they expect the benefits of medical cannabis could provide for that condition. And then optionally, they can add scientific evidence. So they can do a lit review, or if there's a lot of times people will include like medical or like newspaper stories or industry stories as their scientific support. But a lot of times we also do have people with a medical background who are submitting petitions, or like groups that are, forgetting the word, like organizations that are behind, who are like promoting certain conditions, and they'll often have more kind of rigorous evidence to provide. But nonetheless, when we get these petitions, my research unit then will write up issue briefs about them. And I think that you might have seen some of our issue briefs. But basically, what we try to do is we have a focus on clinical trials and observational studies, but because a lot of times that there aren't that many studies that we can look at for specific conditions, we include preclinical studies, such as lab studies or animal models. And then we also look at peer-reviewed journals that have various surveys in them. And we're pretty careful about this because sometimes you don't know the validity of the responses, or you don't know, like, if the population that's part of that survey is representative of the population of interest that we're looking at. So while we'll include that, we also do include some commentary from our perspective about which studies might be more that you should pay more attention to versus other ones. Also, we have any recommendations that come from national organizations or even state level organizations. We will include those in our issue briefs as well. And so here's kind of the process for our petition review. Once those petitions come into our office, we open it up for notice of public meeting and comment, so people can comment about it. And a lot of times we do get comments from either advocacy groups or physicians or people who are just kind of regular people who don't have those types of roles will make comments about adding or not adding a certain condition. And we really do tend to get really people who are strongly opposed, as well as people who are strongly advocating for the condition to be added. Our review panel then meets to look over all of the petitions and the supporting documentation, which includes the issue briefs from my unit. And then they put together a written report that is handed off to the Commissioner of Health. That's in November of every year. And that is presented by people from our office. We'll present it to the commissioner so that it's not just a written report, but there's a better understanding of kind of the process that went on and some of the various points of view that we've heard from people. And then the commissioner then will either approve or deny the petition by December 1st. And whatever she approves, that doesn't go into effect until the following August. And so that gives us our time, because our program is electronically based, so it gives our IT department time to incorporate the new condition into our system. So that's up and ready to go. But it also has this window that is our legislative session. And like I said before, I'm going to give you an example here of originally the commissioner on December 1st had approved macular degeneration as one of the conditions that were going to be approved. But during the legislative session, a legislator had somebody from their jurisdiction come to them. He was a physician, and he was adamantly opposed to including macular degeneration, and had, and brought to light more information that the commissioner didn't have. And so the legislator then went to the commissioner and really advocated for taking it away or not approving it. And the commissioner decided not to include that. That was the only time that happened, but there's potential for that to happen otherwise. So while there's no legislative vote that happens, there can be influence from the legislation during that time period. Some lessons that we've learned is that, so as we started back in 2015, we had 9 conditions. We're up to 19 conditions now. And it kind of feels like while we do this annually, we're getting fewer petitions that come through, and they tend to be really, how can I put this, like really narrow or diseases that don't have a lot of literature or research that's done on them. So it's very difficult to make any type of decision at all. And it kind of feels at this point in time, the next logical step for Minnesota, especially with adult recreational use here and really on the horizon as well, really increasing, is that maybe we're going to be one of those states that allows healthcare practitioners to just say, like, I think my patient is going to benefit from medical cannabis. I want them in the program, even though they're not one of the 19 conditions already listed, approved. So I don't know if we're going to go that way, but that might be a logical next step for us. We've been opposed to that thus far, but through our petition process, we feel like we have many conditions now available. We also find that the petition of our panel is, or composition of our panel is really important. It's important to have impartial medical knowledge as part of that, as well as there's a real benefit to having patients or caregivers part of that panel because they have really important perspective. But what we found was that the patients often are, they're real advocates for our program because these are patients who've seen a lot of benefit from using medical cannabis. And so a lot of times what they see, regardless of what is seen in a research issue or regardless if there's a lot of evidence or very little evidence, they tend to have the idea that, well, this has really helped me. So if there's somebody else out there who it might be able to help, even though we're not sure, we would like it available to them. So that tends to be their position. And from the medical perspective as well, we happen to have a lot of medical providers who were very supportive of the medical program. So while they were more open to listening to some of the pros and or some of the research or lack of research, they also tended to think, hey, as long as there's no evidence that's showing there's a real harm that is documented, they also were kind of on board with, yeah, let's give it a shot. And people can kind of figure out on their own whether or not this is working. So that panel and setting up that panel, I think, is a really important consideration to make as that's going on. And then we also found that there were some conditions that were not approved one year. And so people were just coming back year after year, trying to get it. And we put in place then at some point in time, we said, there has to be, we're not even going to look at the petition again unless there has been significant findings, like peer-reviewed journal findings have come out that talk about why the condition might be added now versus last year. So I think it's kind of important kind of have that insight going into setting up the whole petition process itself. So one of the things that came up year after year was anxiety. And so how we decided to handle that was, instead of having it go through a petition process year after year, we dedicated an anxiety disorder work group be put in place. And so this work group consisted of physicians, including mental health professionals, and that included, physicians as well as therapists, mental health counselors, and even drug counselors. We had participation from the University of Minnesota. We had a physician from there as well as a pharmacist from the U of Minnesota. And then we had staff from our Office of Medical Cannabis. And then we also invited the chief medical officers of our two manufacturers, which are Vireo and Leafline Labs, and they were invited as well. And we set it up into 3 different work group meetings where we did an overview of anxiety. So we were able to have a better, so everybody on the panel could have baseline understanding of anxiety and kind of the subdivisions included in anxiety. We looked at our program currently, the background of our program and statistics of our program of about our patients. The manufacturers then talked about their experience, and we looked at the experience of other states because some states do include anxiety as one of their qualifying conditions. So we kind of looked at what was going on across the country. And then we had a discussion about the current state of anxiety and cannabis research, but also about what treatments people undergo for anxiety and the different subgroups of anxiety. As a result of this work group, it was decided that anxiety was not going to be qualified as a new condition. That was mainly because of the fact that adolescent brains are still developing until the age of 25. And so there was a real concern that opening this up to the program could potentially really influence that group a great deal. And so that was the I think that was the most important reason why it was not accepted as a qualifying condition. However, I can say that PTSD had been included back in 2017, and OCD, interestingly enough, was passed and is in effect now as of August 1st. And so OCD was one of the subcategories of the anxiety work that we looked at. So as a result with that OCD, we have included in some of the conditions we have, like I say, we collect data from our patients, and with OCD, we have we're trying to collect additional data because we have a feeling there's going to be scrutiny after a couple of years to see what's going on with your OCD patients. Is there more harms? There's benefits? What's going on? So we're trying to collect more information and be able to report out on that in 18 to 24 months. And then to talk about PTSD then too, we did a report about PTSD, about our findings. And so this was a group of about 750 patients who were first enrolled in our program between August 1st and December 31st of that first year. We waited 18 months to have some time for them to be in the program and to answer some of our surveys and to go to dispensaries, make purchases. And what we did then is part of our and in addition to just like our regular questions that we ask everybody, we had PTSD patients fill out the PCL5, which is a validated survey instrument or tool that is used to help diagnose PTSD. And it's a 20-item self-reported measures of their symptoms. One of the questions we asked as part of that extra survey was, what was the primary cause of their PTSD? 71% were non-military in nature. 13% were military-based PTSD. 10% preferred not to answer, and 6% said it was both military and non-military. When it came to that non-military, I mean, that's the vast majority of the people in our program. We didn't ask any further about what that meant or how it came about. We just asked in general if it was military or non-military. Transactions during their first year of enrollment, we looked at the products they purchased. There were 9,500 transactions were done, where purchases were made, but there were 15,000 actual products that were made during those purchases. The vast majority of our people purchased products, vaporized oil, so they vaped, basically. And then we also looked at the ratio of the products they purchased for THC to CBD ratios, and over half of them used very high THC to CBD ratio, and about 27% had balanced products. Some of the findings then, also in this report, we found that so we looked and saw what their scores were on that PCL5, and we saw that 96% of our patients actually met the provisional PTSD diagnosis qualifications as part of that. And then what we did is we looked at the scores from that. So that's those 20 symptoms tool that I talked about. And we looked to see if there was a difference between the survey filled out at enrollment and then 3 months after their first purchase of products. And we saw that between 50 and 71% of our patients had a clinically meaningful improvement in their PTSD symptoms. Now, I have to say, just as a reminder, these are people who are in our program who are in our program and who are spending the money to be in our program and purchasing these products. So if somebody did not see benefit from it, they're not going to continue in our program. So if somebody filled out if somebody started with us, they dropped off, we don't know their experience. These are people who are experiencing some type of benefit. But it is interesting to note that there was a high percentage of people who were finding clinically meaningful improvements in their symptoms. And that was between whether it be military or non-military causes of PTSD. Now, in addition, so that was a specific PTSD survey. We also asked everyone in our patient population about what they see as the benefit from using medical cannabis. We have them rated on a scale of 1, meaning no benefit, up to 7, being a great benefit. And so for our PTSD patients, 76% indicated a benefit rating of 6 or 7, meaning they saw great benefit from the products. And then some of the most important benefits they said they got was 23% indicated that there was a reduction in anxiety, 16% improved sleep, 13% improved mood or emotional regulation, and then 12% with pain reduction. There were adverse events that were reported as well. Most people who had adverse events, they were very mild to moderate, and the most common ones were dry mouth, increased appetite, and then increased anxiety, drowsiness, or fatigue. Fortunately, there were no serious adverse events which we identify as being life-threatening or requiring hospitalization. And then I just want to leave you with a few quotes from our patients. As a reminder, these are from patients who are seeing benefit from being in our program, but you can see that it can really, really impact a person's life in meaningful ways. Here's a person who said they were using cannabis, as a medication, but now being part of a medical program, they really had better control of what kind of product they were using and could control the dosage better. And then this last quote too, this person really saw a difference in their life. And, they also commented about their last sentence here. The only hope I have is that it becomes more affordable, as I'm barely able to afford it now. And that's what we hear from our patients a lot of times. Well, most of our patients will talk about how expensive medical cannabis is. And that's something that we try to continue to work on. That was part of the reason we had, here, let me stop sharing my screen and I can just talk to you a little bit here. There we go. So that was part of the impetus to get raw flower available, because patients were really interested in being able to smoke cannabis, and there was thought that that would really help bring down the costs of all the other products that our manufacturers make. I haven't looked in the past few months, but to be honest, we haven't seen a great reduction yet in the cost of those other products, and that might just be the course of it takes time to get sales volumes up enough with the smokable flower to be able to impact some of those other produced products. So we'll see about that. But another thing for Minnesota is we used to have a $200 annual fee that patients paid to be in our program. But this last legislative session, we eliminated that completely. So now no one has to pay an annual fee to be part of our program. And since eventually they'll be going from yearly recertification to every 3 years, that also will cut down on, the cost it is to go see a healthcare practitioner for this. So hopefully we're really reducing the cost to our patients, and we'll continue to try to do that.
David,
So
thank
James, that's all I have for you, but I'm happy to take any questions.
No, thank you. And I have a few just to get us started, but if you have a question for David, please just raise your hand. But can I just say, I think this is a good model of how you can bring a lot of voices to the table and have it be science and evidence-based for adding new qualifying conditions. So I really appreciate you walking us through that. It sounds like ultimately the decision, while there is potential for legislative input, rests in the hands of the Commissioner of Health after a
Definitely.
very thorough review. Obviously commissioners of health everyone brings their own unique perspective to that role. You've overseen kind of 2 commissioners of health, in your tenure. Have you seen any change in either the process or the approach between those 2 unique people?
Yeah, that's interesting because we just had a change in commissioners over this past year. So it'll be the first time the new commissioner will be overseeing this process. So
Okay.
It will be interesting to see what she brings to the table and kind of her decision-making process. And I will have to say,
yeah, sorry.
And while it is in the hands of the Commissioner of Health, there have been over the years some legislators who have not been happy with that and who have wanted to bring it back to the legislators. But in my opinion, it makes sense to keep it within the health department or someone who actually has knowledge of health and the healthcare system and what patients go through, and not have it be as political. But I mean, that's my opinion.
Yes, thank you. And then my last question, because we have a number of people that have raised their hands, and of course, Julie or Kyle, if you have questions, please. I'm going to try and just moderate this a little bit, so please raise your hands as well. But I will prioritize you guys. You noted that there's some pretty remote areas of Minnesota. I mean, do those patients have sufficient access to medical cannabis, as far as you can tell?
No. I don't think so. So it's interesting because I just moved back to the Twin Cities metropolitan area. I used to live in the northeast corner of Minnesota, and I'm not a participant in our program, but I know that while my clinic was 20 minutes away from me, none of the doctors there were healthcare practitioners in our program. So I would have had to have gone 2.5 hours to see a healthcare practitioner. And I also would have had the nearest dispensary was 2 hours away.
Yeah. And
I just think it's tricky, in Minnesota for what feels like half the year, it's snowy and, conditions for travel are not always that great. And having to travel that long of a distance, especially if you have a chronic condition, or, especially if you have pain or anything like that, it's tricky. I mean, it's hard. So my opinion is no. The way it was set up, these dispensaries, there had to be at least one dispensary in every congressional district. And so that's how it kind of got spread across. But, for example, I was in a really, really large congressional district when I lived in northern Minnesota. So that's what I say. It was a 2-hour drive to it. Now, one of the things we did, we increased it from originally it was a 30-day supply that patients could get, and we increased that to a 90-day supply to help with that situation so people wouldn't have to make as many trips to a dispensary. But yeah, that's definitely a consideration.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to just start with the board members just because ultimately we're going to have to make recommendations. So Julie, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I have just two questions. One, going back to what you talked about in terms of what's submitted with the petitions and the types of research or articles or information that people submit. How does Minnesota determine what research is valuable to be considered and what is maybe not useful? I mean, research, kind of under the term research can sometimes come from advocacy groups on kind of both sides of this. And so how do you all determine what is really useful and neutral information?
Yeah, so we include both, like whatever information we get from various advocacy groups, pro or con, we include in the packet of information to our panel. But then, like my team, when we talk about our briefs that we go through, we will kind of try to give a background about like what are the most like considered the most scientifically valid pieces of evidence, and kind of try to give a little bit of understanding that like here's an article that we came across, and it includes the types of patients that we the patient population that is of interest to us, or we try to highlight some of the pros and cons of various articles.
Okay, that's helpful. I just find that one of the most challenging parts of doing this work is determining what is really useful and what isn't,
Yeah.
And then my other question was about the tracking you did around PTSD seems really, really useful. And I don't believe that we're doing any of that kind of tracking in Vermont on our patients and like the specific products that they're purchasing and that sort of thing. Did you have to have patients give permission for that? Is that just permission that's granted as part of being part of the program? Like, how did you get to the point of being able to track at that level of detail?
Yeah, so I wasn't here when the program was that first year, but the people who designed it into there. So patients are made aware of, and they sign off on the fact that we are going to be collecting this information, and while we write reports about it and share it with others, keeping it all their private information out of it. So that's not a concern, but that's part of what they sign up for when they're in our program.
Okay, that's helpful to know. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Julie. Kyle, did you have a question?
Thank you so much for being with us this morning, David, knowing it's 2 hours, 1 hour earlier for you.
1 hour. It's only 1 hour.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I don't feel as bad. No, I'm just kidding. I had a question about the requirement of having a pharmacist in your medical facilities. I find that very interesting, especially with some of the testimonials about dosage and proper dosing, and how that's really helped certain folks find value from a medicinal perspective here. Does your office provide any review of those pharmacists that are hired to work in these dispensaries? Do they have to go through any CLEs or any cannabis-specific courses that might help them understand this specific area a little bit better? And then obviously, a pharmacist garners a pretty high-paying wage. Is there any support from the state for these dispensaries to be able to hire a competent pharmacist to come in and work at these dispensaries, as opposed to some other opportunity that they might have that might, pay a little bit more?
Yeah, no, excellent questions. The answer is no to both of those. So we don't have any oversight about what pharmacists they employ. And wait, what was your second question? The second?
I think you answered. It was whether or not you provide any support for dispensaries on that requirement, recognizing that's another financial cost that I mentioned. The pharmacists are one of the highest paid employees at those dispensaries.
They absolutely are. And the manufacturers aren't thrilled with the fact that they have to have pharmacists in their dispensaries. So I think but that's just the way it is. I mean, for them to be a manufacturer in Minnesota, they had to do that.
Right.
I can say that, now that we're getting legal, or I mean, adult recreational use, it'll be interesting to see if that changes. I mean, in our program, we hope that it doesn't, that the pharmacists are still going to be required, but I have a feeling there's going to be some jockeying to try to get, I don't know. That might change. I'm not saying that there won't be pharmacists in there, but I don't know if they're like, maybe they'll just have special hours for medical purchases to be made. I'm not sure how that's going to shake out, but I think that we're going to probably get even more feedback from our manufacturers and dispensaries about that.
Great, thank you. And just one quick follow-up, and I'll leave it to everybody else because I know there's a lot of hands up. Just in your role as a former co-chair of CANRA, are you aware of any other states that have that pharmacist requirement for their medical programs?
I don't know which states, but I know there are a couple of other ones.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right.
Sure.
I'll leave it to the rest of the.
I'm just going to go down the order as people raise their hands. Start with Dr. McLean.
Thanks, James. So I have 4 brief comments and then 1 question. So the first comment I would make, in your opening remarks, you talked about the 2017 National Academies review paper. And I think that there has been very legitimate disagreement about the findings of that review. And our Vermont Academic Detailing Program, when we reviewed that review paper, we took a more conservative read on the recommendations or the findings that came out of that. So just,
thank you for that. Yeah, good to know.
Yeah. And then in response to Julie, there is a agreed upon method for grading evidence in science. And in clinical studies, the gold standard of therapy is always a randomized controlled trial with appropriate blinding of the subjects and the researchers and predetermined outcomes and the whole method of doing that properly. And if you want more information on that, the best place to go is probably the United States Preventive Services Task Force, which has been around for probably 20 years and makes recommendations on preventive approaches to healthcare, like how often you should get a colonoscopy or what vaccinations work and don't work, that type of thing. So there is an agreed upon approach to that. As David had noted, there's major methodological limitations to serving people who've stuck with the program, right? So the people who it works for are the ones who are staying in it. So there's kind of a natural bias built in there. And I'm glad that he pointed that out. And then the other comment about the Minnesota approach that I think is a good one is that they've set aside the resources, time, and assembled an expert group to dig in on something like anxiety, and came up with a recommendation not to necessarily proceed. So, I think for Vermont, having a group that's appropriately resourced to make decisions, and, we could talk all day about who should be on that and which representatives and whatever, but I think having a group that has the time and space to do that appropriately is, I think, a good way to go forward. And then the question I had is for David. So do you do any, so I love the fact that you're surveying people. I think that's great, getting their input. Do you do any specific surveys or investigation about the adverse effects, and in particular, cannabis use disorder?
Yeah, so as part of the surveys that we include, there's a portion about like symptoms, like, and whether there's like affected, like not at all or to a great deal. But we do also we ask about adverse events. And then we'll ask about like the severity, so there's 2 ways we do it. We'll ask about kind of like just out and out, like, have you had adverse events, or I forget the wording of it. It's not quite so it's not termed necessarily as adverse events, but it kind of gives an explanation of what that might mean. And then we also have a list that they can choose from what kind of adverse events. And then from that, we'll ask the severity of it, mild, moderate, or severe. And then we also have like any actual, like, adverse events that people have to report. Well, it's desired that people report to, it's called safety line. Is that what it's called? Anybody know? Anyhow, it's a national organization that collects negative adverse effects, and we get a report from them every month. Our manufacturers have to report any adverse events to us through that.
Great. Any follow-ups, Dr. McLean?
The only other follow-up, I guess, is a comment that it might be interesting to come up with a method of surveying people who came into the program and left the program to get a sense of, those are the people you're kind of missing. So, for people for whom it might not have been an effective approach to their condition.
Yeah, this fall, we're going to try to implement something along that line. To try to reach out to those people who are no longer, who haven't been in the program for 8 months, haven't made any type of purchase, and then we're going to try to reach out to them and try to understand. So we'll see how that works.
Great. All right. I just want to note the time briefly. We were trying to turn to our next witness at 10 o'clock, but this is an important conversation. We don't always have the opportunity to talk to our partners in other states. So I'm going to keep going down the list, but just please, everyone who's asking questions, be mindful of the time. Amelia?
Yeah. Amelia Mishi, Communications Director for Green Mountain Patients Alliance. Really happy to see you here, David. I did have a couple questions. I'll keep them quick, though. My first is, in Vermont, we do have mandatory training for bud tenders. And that training, for the most part, actually takes place with one of our speakers later this morning. But I was wondering if that exists in Minnesota, any sort of mandatory education or training for the people who work in dispensaries who aren't necessarily these pharmacists.
Yeah, we don't. It's something that we're looking into now, because I think there's more and more national trainings, and then there are trainings that our manufacturers might impose on their employees, but we don't regulate that in any sort of way. Okay.
And then my other question was, Vermont's looking at overhauling our condition and application system, and that's why we're here. In Minnesota, do you find that aside from specific conditions, you see petitions for symptoms often? Because just one of our recommendations as an advocacy group has been that we kind of switch more over to a symptom-based approach rather than a condition-based approach, just to increase access, because as you well know, plenty of conditions share symptoms, and adding them individually can kind of be an arbitrary process.
Right. Yeah, no, you're right. I think our chronic pain, that is, I'm not sure how to think about chronic pain, if that's more symptom or if that's, I guess that would be kind of one of the major I don't know. I'm not a physician, so I'm not sure if chronic pain is an actual disease condition, or I'm not sure. But otherwise, it's disease oriented.
Yeah, all I would say is that, we have not seen a state go the pure symptom-based approach yet. And that's not to say that it shouldn't happen or it won't happen, but it's certainly not a model that's been used across the state.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you.
Sure.
Jill?
Hi, yeah, thanks so much, David. I'm Jill. I'm with the Medical Society, and this panel approach is definitely something we would love to have. It just seems like taking that political piece out would be great. So, just wondering how people are nominated, how people get put on it, like how are those 4 other people added, and then how that works. Is it pretty complicated? Do a lot of people want to be on, or is that political? I guess I'm asking.
Yeah, that's a great question. I might have to get back to you, or I will have to get back to you on that because I'm not positive. I can say that there is an application process to get on it. To be honest, we haven't had a lot of people interested, so I don't know how much. I don't know what the rejection rate is for that, and if we just kind of took oh, thank goodness we filled the spot. So I'll have to get back to you on that. Although I can say now that we've passed adult recreational use, all of a sudden we've got a lot of people interested in being on panels because our adult use is also going to be having a medical or a panel involved with that as well. And so that one has gotten a lot of interest.
That was going to be my other question is the medical panel also going to be looking at the recreational, or is it going to be a separate panel, and how is that going to operate? Just because, yeah, we've seen a real shift in Vermont, it seems like, on the focus to recreational.
Yeah, so we are at this point in time, we're completely separate. In fact, there's kind of a wall between us because what's happening is from the adult use side, there's a new agency that's being developed over the course of the next 18 months. And once that is developed, our medical program will go under that umbrella as opposed to be in the Department of Health. But for right now, we're in health and they're developing their thing. And so we're basically separate at this point in time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And Jill, for a follow-up meeting, I'll try and look at the kind of appointment process for the various states that have these types of boards. Jessie Lynn?
Hi, thanks so much for being here and answering questions. A couple questions, please, if you know. Does your program mandate third-party lab testing and testing for contaminants and terpenes, or is that just in-house and cannabinoid testing? I don't know if you want to answer one at a time, if that's easier for you.
Yes, because I'll forget what the question is. So yes, we have lab testing we don't have a state lab that tests it. It's third-party testing.
Great. And do you guys test for contaminants as well as potency, and are terpenes mandated or just THC?
So potency and heavy metals and things like that. We just have, because flour's so new, I think, and I'm not on this. We have another area that deals with this, but I do think we are looking at terpenes too.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you offer any financial aid support programs? You mentioned, that is one of the barriers to people accessing cannabis medicine. And do they have delivery options?
We no. So we don't offer any other type of financial support. And we're not, up until now, we haven't allowed delivery. But in 2025, part of that legislative package includes that there can be delivery options, and that won't go into effect until 2025, but that's when that will happen.
Great, thank you. And then last question is, do you offer any patient education specifically, or is it just a conversation that a patient gets to have with the pharmacist?
We offer, we have documents that we send to patients that have information and about warnings and things like that, but it's not there's no one-on-one or anything like that. It's it's the patient will have to read a document that hopefully is written in an understandable way and in an engaging way, but it's coming from the state. So sometimes that can be difficult to achieve that. But yeah, we do provide written documentation for folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jessie Lynn. So again, we're getting short on time, and I've only scheduled this for 2 hours, and so I know certain members will need to drop off. Nels, I'm going to move to you, and I'm just going to ask that everyone just ask a single question, try and make it brief, and anything that we need to follow up with David, I can, you can send to the board, and we'll email David and try and post answers.
Good.
Yeah, I'd be happy to follow up with anything.
I'll abbreviate my question. The levels of evidence appear to be everywhere, all across the board with the conditions that are allowed. I'm wondering what other factors, in addition to levels of evidence, are considered for adding qualifying conditions in Minnesota.
Well, it's that, and I think that, like I say, our review panel is one who is pretty generous with just making sure that there's no real negative, harmful effects that are known. So it's kind of a what can I say, like a permissive board. To be honest, I mean, that's how I see it.
Nels, is there a follow-up to that?
No, that sort of supports my impression, so I was glad to hear that frankly stated. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Ivo?
Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, now you hear me. I actually do not have that many questions for David, as many questions I have for Vermont board, because I think that the David and Minnesota board are doing an appropriate thing. I mean, we have
Ivo, why don't we just keep a comment? We'll have a public comment session a little bit later, if you don't
so
mind.
yeah,
We're just really short.
Whatever I wanted to ask David was already asked.
Okay, great. And if questions do come to mind about the Minnesota model, please just email them to the board, and we'll make sure David gets an answer. Next on my list is David Guest.
Right, that would be me. I just want to say what an excellent program this is, and thank you for giving it. The question I have is about epilepsy. I'm a neuropsychiatrist and an MD, and I actually have one patient who has had a miraculous recovery from seizures. The question revolves around the seizure type, because it's not the kind where you think of somebody falling over and shaking on the ground. It's a subtle psychological disconnect that has been addressed with cannabis. And my question is simply, have you developed any kind of a sense of different types of seizures? In other words, seizures as a band of illnesses rather than just a major motor seizure?
Yeah, no, we haven't.
Okay, I just would suggest you keep that in mind, because this person's life has been saved.
Oh, I believe it. I will say too that because we collect a lot of data from our patients, we are able to partner with other physicians and researchers in the state, and we're able to do some sharing of our data so that they can, like, we have an oncologist who participates in our program, and we've worked with him on several studies that he's done, who has tried to kind of look more specifically, and he's interested in certain types of cancers. So, if there's a Minnesota physician who is interested in looking at seizures, we're always open to kind of figuring out if there's additional questions we need to ask or set something up.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great, thanks a lot. Tito, you got the last question here, and if you could, please make it brief.
Yep, quick. Thank you for coming today. So my question is about, I'm fascinated by the need for the actual on-site pharmacist. Inside our dispensary, we use what we call a cannabis specialist. So I'm curious, in your when you follow up about this, are the what are people saying? What are the dispensaries and what are the actual pharmacists saying? Is it effective, them being there? Is it taken seriously? Is it necessary, this type of thing?
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer to that. I think that we set it up because we thought it would be medically important to have kind of that additional medical vision or provision. I know that patients find it beneficial. We also have the ability for our healthcare practitioners who agree to like have conversations with pharmacists that they can connect to talk more specifically about patients. And you know, our healthcare practitioners do not prescribe cannabis in any sort of way. You know, that's but they often will have an interest in speaking with a pharmacist to kind of so that they can understand the condition of a person and what some harms or worries, concerns that they might have, and they can talk to a pharmacist about that. But I don't know exactly how the manufacturers feel about having pharmacists in there, and I don't know. You know, a lot of patients, once they kind of get established, they purchase the same products. So, but they still need to have this oversight from the pharmacist. So, I mean, that's an area that might seem kind of redundant at certain times, but we haven't reviewed that at this point in time.
David, thank you so much for joining us, for leading kind of all of our medical programs through the CANRA process, sharing information. You know, everyone's trying to figure this out. Everyone's trying to kind of understand the therapeutic effects of cannabis and how we can help the patients that really rely on this as a medicine. So thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
You know, we'll post your slides if you're all right with that to our website. And if we have any follow-up questions, maybe I can just direct them to you in the future. Absolutely.
Thanks for inviting me today, James. Good. Yeah. And good luck with everything going on. I know it can be tricky and there's a lot of work to do. So good luck.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All righty.
So we're going to make a very quick transition here, just given the time. You know, in addition to qualifying conditions, and I don't think this is the last we will talk about them, but you know, the legislature asked us to look at how the use of cannabis is communicated to patients and patient providers, and appropriate treatment protocols for patients. So, you know, we live in a world where not a lot of the traditional regulatory pathway for pharmaceuticals does not exist for cannabis. You know, this really means that doctors are not permitted to prescribe cannabis. Many are reluctant to even recommend cannabis. Certainly, they're not going to give, you know, there's no approved guidance on appropriate formulations or treatment protocols. And then this, we find, creates a negative feedback loop where patients then become reluctant to talk to their treating physicians about cannabis use and are largely on their own to navigate, you know, the complex world of cannabinoids and terpenes and interactions with other drugs. So the next two witnesses, in various respects, have tried to fill this gap in various ways. And I thought it might be helpful to have a conversation with each about their work. I'm going to start with Dr. Colin Freeman. He's an MD, PhD. You know, his PhD specialty is in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology. He is the director of the Trauma Physiology Lab at UVM's Lerner School of Medicine. He's an associate professor of emergency medicine and pharmacology at UVM. And he's also an attending emergency physician at UVM Medical. So, I mean, he's also a great fiddle player, but, you know, I'll leave it there. Kalev, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the work that you're doing. If you don't mind, I'm just going to jump right into a few questions. You know, how would you characterize the current state of clinician education around cannabis use?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, and nice to see you guys here on the panel. It's I think it's improved compared to previously, and I'm going to say previously with reference. I can put a specific time point on this, is April 25th, 2017, which is about 6 years ago. The Journal of the American Medical Education, JAMA, which is the leading journal in our field in medicine, interviewed us at ELCOM, the College of Medicine, because our pharmacology department was actually teaching medical cannabis guidance based on the evidence. And they interviewed us to say, and the title of the article you can find on JAMA, April 25th, was Medical Marijuana is Legal in Most States, but physicians have little evidence to guide them. And at that time, they mentioned University of Vermont's Larimer College of Medicine pharmacology course. It was called Pharm 296 Medical Cannabis. And the first semester that launched back in 2017, the school had to change the location of the course twice because the enrollment was 99 people and filled the hall. And that included other physicians and other medical students, along with scientists and undergraduates. At that time in 2017, and when that JAMA article was written, there was actually very little available in terms of formal education taught by medical schools or colleges of medicine based on evidence-based guidelines, in part because there wasn't as much evidence at that time. So since 2017, I think we have seen quite a bit of both emerging evidence for potential risks as well as therapeutic benefits of cannabinoids, and also more educational programs available to teach them.
And what is the kind of curriculum that's at those? Because the legislature told us that we needed to identify, if possible, strains of cannabis that might be effective for specific conditions. Can you maybe just talk about how that might not be the most plausible path forward, but how there might be kind of other things, the cannabinoid profiles, terpenes, other components of the cannabis plant that might be a more appropriate pathway for trying to think about things like treatment protocols?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I mean, I'll take a philosophical point too on this. When I graduated medical school at the University of Colorado, our dean, Dr. Krugman, told us that half of everything we taught you in medical school was wrong. Unfortunately, we don't know which half, and that's going to be our job as physicians. And part of our job as physicians is to do continuing medical education, because new papers are published every day. All right. So the question about cannabinoid profiles, strains, and terpenes is actually a very good one. And I think the legislator is right on track in asking that question. The problem is the evidence isn't there yet. It's very difficult scientifically, or in pharmacology. We're used to working with single molecules, fentanyl, morphine, amoxicillin, THC. But when you get to a plant product that has dozens of individual cannabinoids and terpenes, we simply have not done the rigorous research to be able to tell people specific combinations of terpenes that exist within different strains and cultivars that people are growing in specific contexts. We can't very easily make recommendations based on evidence. So the question is actually a good one that the legislators have asked, but it's not something that's part of current medical cannabis education because we don't have the data.
So if they asked us to think about treatment protocols, and again, like, to me, I think most, heavy users or people that are more familiar with cannabis have figured it out for themselves. But I'm trying to think, like, when I think about treatment protocols, and if the board is going to endorse any sort of treatment protocols, I think we just need to kind of get to the molecular level, and also just think about low information cannabis users, first-time patients, and just give them some very basic best practices around treatment protocols. Is there any way for us to start thinking in that direction about treatment protocols, kind of at the cannabinoid level, or the kind of balancing CBD and THC or CBG, at that level?
That's a good question too. Again, I think it's getting a little ahead of the evidence that we have. There's just not a lot of evidence for different mixtures of cannabinoids for specific conditions or treatment protocols to this date, with the exception of CBD. there are data now looking at combination. The FDA approval process is moving forward for the 1-to-1 mixture of THC and CBD called nabiximols. So that compound is in trials for conditions such as seizure, chronic pain, and some psychiatric conditions. But those have not provided enough evidence for us to make more broad conclusions about specific ratios for specific conditions.
Yeah. I
can also speak to protocols, I guess, quickly. In terms of protocols, there are a couple protocols out I've seen for chronic pain, for pain management. The use of cannabinoids as an adjunct for chronic pain management has been recommended in the American Academy of, I think it's in Canada, that their medical journal, the JAMA equivalent in Canada, has published some guidelines for adjunct use of cannabinoids for pain. But that's focused on THC specifically.
Yeah. So, I mentioned at the outset, I don't think you had joined quite yet, but there's a number of states that kind of put the decision about a qualifying condition in the hands of a treating physician on a case-by-case basis. This patient that's in my care may benefit from cannabis, and in my professional opinion, the potential benefits outweigh the potential adverse consequences. I've got a hard time believing that our legislature would just go for that outright. I'm trying to think, is there what sort of education would a kind of treating physician, what would we want a treating physician to have in order to have that kind of ability to recommend cannabis for one of their patients?
That's interesting. Yeah. I think philosophically, as physicians are we're trained to make decisions and follow medical education, and also we know our patients the best. So I think many physicians would prefer to have the individual prerogative to have those discussions and protocols with their patients if they have the right education, right? So is the education there is the second question, I guess. And there is education available now. Jill Sudoff, Dr. Sudoff Gurns on too. She can speak to what what's currently available at VMS. But I know historically, VMS, LCOM, and UVM Medical Center have all offered lectures where physicians can get continuing medical education at a lecture format in person and at certain conferences for CME credits. So that's available occasionally in Vermont. Other medical societies, such as Massachusetts, the MMS, have historically offered a 4-credit cannabis education through MMS, and other states have recommended that their physicians go to MMS for the CME credit in order to have the capacity to enroll patients in their states. So MMS has been historically one of the leaders in medical education for New England, at least. Other opportunities that are available today, there are UVM programs. So the University of Vermont Honor College of Medicine does offer a medical cannabis certificate. That's an 8-week program for pharmacists, nurses, or doctors to get specific training in this content, which focuses on the evidence basis of treatments for different conditions and what protocols we know at the current time. And again, this changes year to year as we get new data. Colorado has a very similar program, but in CU, it's not offered through the med school, it's offered through the pharmacy school. So the Colorado pharmacy program offers a similar 8-week certificate program. The University of Maryland, again, pharmacy, it's not the medical school, but through the pharmacy school in Maryland, they offer similar certificate content. And the other ones are probably Yale, Johns Hopkins, and UCSD. So there are a few other medical schools that are offering specific training that is available for continuing ed that we could recommend here in Vermont, that physicians who would like to prescribe more generally, perhaps they could take some show documentation of continuing ed in that area and maintenance of that training, whether it's an hour or 2 or more per year. That might be a way to make sure that our physicians are getting that content.
Yeah, it's great that all those resources exist. A number of, as I kind of alluded to, or maybe even I said, a physician, is allowed to make in certain states a recommendation for, on a case by case basis for a condition that doesn't otherwise exist on the qualifying conditions list. But then sometimes they have to meet a heightened standard if they're going to do that. New York, for instance, I just have their language. If it's, a physician can recommend cannabis if in their judgment the patient is likely to receive therapeutic or palliative benefit from the primary or adjunctive treatment with medical cannabis for that condition. I mean, given the state of science, is that even a feasible standard, or is this kind of like, well, people are kind of going out on a limb to just recommend cannabis?
Well, again, physicians, our typical practice, and others, Dr. McQueen's on too, and others can speak to it. We're used to, we can provide drugs off label. So once the FDA approves a product, for FDA approved products, the physician are used to having the prerogative to recommend the medication for a specific patient. And, for example, I know pediatric brain tumors, as an example of an area that physicians have, recommended cannabis for, potentially at high concentrations. So off-label use is something that physicians do in their practice. In cannabis, it's a tough challenge because there is no FDA guidance at this point. So we don't have a label, for cannabis use to guide us. So everything is in some ways off-label. So then the question becomes, who is the most knowledgeable authority in a patient's care and providing that guidance? Is it their individual physician? Is it a committee appointed by the state? Is it a specialist who specializes in this content from a pharmacy or pharmacology background? So I would advocate, again, to treat this cannabinoid product as we would any other drug, and provide physicians with as much training and as much evidence as they can to make the decisions for their patients and put it in the physician's hands. Yeah.
I think everyone that I've spoken to on this study group has a desire to move the question about new qualifying conditions out of a purely political process, really try and have an evidence-based approach. I think we saw the kind of Minnesota model where they have a board that has, medical professionals and patients and advocates. And then we've seen, Connecticut, it's just all that is allowed to kind of review the science around new qualifying conditions. Utah is all medical professionals. If we were going to adopt an approach like this, that, a board that could help evaluate emerging science, potentially add new qualifying conditions, potentially help us understand effective treatment protocols, what kind of expertise would you like to see on that board?
That's a good question too.
And you can think about it and get back to me. It's complicated, and it might be helpful for me to just run through the other states and who they have on their kind of compassionate care boards or, medical advisory boards.
Yeah, I mean, again, it becomes a tough question because, there's over 5,000 peer-reviewed medical journals published that are indexed on PubMed at NLM. And so to keep abreast of all the literature is quite tough unless you're at a medical school, this is what we do at the College of Medicine. So I would advocate for at least some representation from the medical school, because this is, again, your cutting edge research. And in Vermont, we have one med school, so it's easy you're not going to upset anybody by not including them.
Great. Well, are you willing to stick around for a few questions?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy. I'm free till noon.
And then Jesse Lynn, I got to ask, you're our next witness. Are you willing to stick around maybe a little bit past 11 to kind of walk through the nurses hotline program?
Yeah, I can go till about 11:20. I do have a patient at 11:30.
Great. All right. Well, then if there's questions for Dr. Freeman, please just raise your virtual hand. Try and get through them very quickly. But start with Dr. McLean.
Thanks, Caleb. I really appreciate your level of expertise on this topic. And if we're going to have a board of experts, I think you would be my first choice to be on it. But the one downside to the idea of, any medical professional for any condition is it gets pretty haphazard because the level of knowledge of each individual will vary a lot. And as Caleb said, keeping up with this stuff is a full-time job. So it's really a system that just says any condition, any symptom, it's up to you and your patient is really not a system in a sense. It's just pretty haphazard.
That's a good point. And I think that's where we were with the discussion is should it be any physician or any healthcare provider or only the ones that have done some documented some CME in this area? I think you're right. And the reason again too is that until very recently, med schools didn't teach us content. So many of our physicians actually, are very good practicing physicians in the state of Vermont who have not actually had any education on the pharmacology, the risk profile, what are the most likely side effects. So the actual content that you need to recommend this has not been taught in our medical schools until recently. And so I think you're exactly right. It can't just be any physician recommending it until we brought them up to speed. And I don't know the best, is the CME the appropriate mechanism for that, or is there another way? But I agree with you. Yeah.
Any other questions for Dr. Freeman? All right. Well, thank you very much. I know it's kind of a last minute that you were able to join us, and I really appreciate your, continued kind of oversight in this area and kind of pushing the ball forward.
Thank you all for your efforts here too, and everyone's advocacy. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Next up, again, the legislature asked us to look at how the use of cannabis is communicated to patients, and are there any best practices around treatment protocols? I think Jessie Lynn Dolan is been at the forefront of filling this void in the absence of kind of the more traditional FDA regulators, stepping in. She's the president of the American Nurses Association Vermont chapter. She's the Vermont Cannabis Nurses Association founder, and she runs, Jessie, what would you refer to it as, the nurses hotline?
I just call it the Cannabis Nurse Hotline.
Yeah, and essentially, these, people that have been recommended for cannabis or, have a new medical card, and just are very reluctant, or very kind of reluctant to talk to their provider, or just there's very much a void of information for kind of new users. And Jessie Lynn, fortunately, has stepped in, and we hear great things about the program at the Cannabis Board. A lot of people write in to kind of talk about how helpful it's been, but I've actually never called, and I would love to just kind of bring you into this meeting to talk about how, what sort of calls you're taking, what sort of information you're providing, and just how it's been received and how it's going.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to try to quickly screen share if I can and go over a PowerPoint. I will go a little bit quicker. I know we're pushed for time, but thank you for having me. As Chair Pepper mentioned, I work with the American Nurse Association, and I'm excited to say as of today that they have just acknowledged cannabis nursing as a specialty nursing practice, which is big here in Vermont, or nationally. I also am co-founder of the Green Mountain Patients Alliance as well. I've been a research nurse at the University of Vermont for both opioids and cannabis. I formerly specialized in opioid use disorder, specifically in pregnancy and parenting and human milk feeding and infancy withdrawal, and have taken the UVM course that Caleb spoke about. So thanks, Caleb, for offering such a great course. I quickly, is this sharing okay? Here we go. Oh, there we go. Oh, no, that doesn't want to work. Hopefully you guys can see this. I don't screen share often.
It's kind of stuck between two slides.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's kind of not moving. Hold on 1 second. Oh, and now you're just seeing a blurry screen. There we go. Hopefully this works this time. Okay, there we go. So I'm here to describe a service that I offer, which, as you know, Chair Pepper so nicely said, it's trying to really bridge a recognized gap as well as reduce harm for cannabis patients and consumers. So we offer 15-minute free appointments for consumers, for patients, for cannabis employees through what we call the free cannabis nurse hotline. So we offer over 1,000 appointments annually on Fridays between 9 a.m. and 2:30 in the afternoon. Callers sign up with a myriad of questions, some of which we'll go over today. The service is available thanks to our supporting partners and community sponsors, as you see pictured here today. Here's what a few of our retailers quote and have told us about the hotline. I'll read the one on the right from Winooski Organics. The nurse hotline has been one of the most beneficial resources to our customers and bud tenders over the last year. It's shown to be incredibly valuable to customers with medical questions that our bud tenders are not qualified to answer. They are always recommending folks with questions to call the hotline. We cannot say enough great things about this service, and we really hope it can be expanded to help more people. So on the left, you have Grass Queen, another dispensary in Burlington, talking specifically how they refer people to the hotline to help them make more appropriate dosing choices, consumption methods. So we really appreciate our supporters. So 15 minutes is pretty quick, right? So what do we go over in 15 minutes? Well, believe it or not, we can go over a lot of information, and most of the questions cannabis consumers have can be talked about and taken care of, at least to a level where they feel more supported and educated and comfortable within that first 15 minutes or so. So when callers sign up, we ask them to share anything that they're willing that might be helpful for our meeting together. Believe it or not, this is one participant's sign up email. So they want to know a lot of different things. What's the best to take for pain, for sleep? They don't want to actually get high. Is it lab tested? Is it safe? Should they be trying edibles? Should they be smoking? So a lot of different questions. What we also see is a theme to a lot of these questions, and oftentimes based on the amount of people who are using cannabis for specific reasons. So we know people are using cannabis for pain and anxiety. How will cannabis affect other medications that they're taking? So medication interactions. They don't want to do other pharmaceuticals and heavier drugs. They'd like to use a combination, including CBD, because they're not looking, again, for that high or their euphoria. They don't necessarily want to smoke, and they want to understand how edibles work versus inhalation. They have inflammation, they have neuropathy. Do they get a medical card? Does it make sense for them? We have a lot of callers calling about anxiety, and that is not one of the conditions eligible for a medical card here in the state of Vermont, but definitely a condition. We don't want people just self-monitoring and dosing without any education and guidance at all. So they want guidance on specific strains, which we know can be challenging, but if we do have proper lab testing and cannabinoid and terpene profiles, we can help guide people. They want to understand what dosing they should use, medication interactions, new users. We have people calling saying, my doctor told me to use this, but my doctor doesn't know what to tell me and how to guide me. So can you help me? People want to be careful. They want to be cautious. They're on several medications. They want to be able to have that conversation openly and comfortably with somebody. I often have people call with cancer. That's one of the most common calls that I get. People calling to help their family with cancer. So calling for their dad or their mom, asking the same questions. What strains might work? With modes of consumption. So should they be smoking or edibles or topicals? Complications or complicating treatment regimens like immunotherapy, definitely a different way to ingest and treat cannabis consumption than if you're not on immunotherapy. I have people calling when they're not responding to treatment, wanting high dose RSO or FICO dosing regimens and saying their care team supports them, but they don't know how to help them and guide them. And if they don't have guidance, they might just be looking online. And when you look online for a typical RSO protocol, they're going to tell you to ingest up to 700-800 milligrams of THC every day. And without support, that can be concerning. We have cancer survivors calling years later saying, I'm still having repercussions from my treatment. Can I use cannabis for? Will cannabis work with? How do I consume cannabis safely? We have partners, husbands and wives calling to help one another. We have calling to help their parents. We have parents calling to help their kids when other medications and traditional treatment pathways have not been successful. We have public guardians and social workers calling with agency approval, but not understanding who to talk to help them take the steps to help their patients. I always tell people I'm not their doctor, I'm not their clinician. Hopefully they can have the conversation with their healthcare provider, and how can I help them have that conversation comfortably, but also acknowledging some people are not ready to have that conversation, and understandably so when we think of the typical scenario of a veteran who's concerned about their federal benefits and that being something that could be negatively affected. We always talk about pharmacokinetics, so we don't go into the deep pharmacological aspects. We talk about the basics. So what's the difference between inhaling cannabis versus eating cannabis? So we know inhalation works much quicker than an edible, could take an hour or a couple hours. And that is just focusing on safety, so they understand their onset and the duration of effects to reduce their harm, but also make it more effective as far as being available, because they can afford it if they're getting the best bang for their buck and the right medication in the way that works for them. We talk about how cannabis works in their body, how it metabolizes, to understand how edibles work differently, but also how that can interact with medications and why that's so important to understand. Dosing is a big one we talk about. Unfortunately, there's no specific standardized dosing and no prescriptions out there, but we really encourage the principle of low and slow, and can't stress that enough. We talk about the typical standardized, if we were to standardize a dose, saying maybe 2.5 milligram THC to start, but I backtrack that usually to 1 milligram for a novice, especially elder person, someone on other medications. The idea is we'd really rather have somebody take their time instead of feel uncomfortably too high or have some negative repercussions and consequences from their dosing. We often have people call with specifics around medications, so side effects of medications. Retired nurses and healthcare professionals calling and knowing cannabis helps them, but they don't have the education because they haven't learned it or they haven't been practicing it as part of their healthcare practice. Medications like Xanax, which aren't safe to just go off cold turkey, and now they're trying to do that with cannabis. So how do we guide them back to their doctor and help them have that conversation, or recognize they're not going to have that conversation with anyone, and at least the 15 minutes we have with them might help to reduce a lot of the possible harm. Drug interactions with polypharmacy we often see. And then other people who are having negative reactions, people calling with CBD, they got rashes, they got welts. So what do they do next? We do discuss medication interactions as a very important thing to recognize is real. We know that it's more likely a concern if they're taking it orally, so if they're taking edibles and pills at the same time. So we do talk to them about monitoring medications and which medications might be more important to monitor and need possible medication adjustments. Again, working with that healthcare provider, but also talking to them about the basic safety aspect of please take your cannabis edible at least an hour or two or more apart from your other pharmaceuticals to help reduce, again, some of that harm if they're not having the in-depth conversation about each medication and the concerns with them. We use social media a little bit to pick up some of the themes and the common reasons people are calling the hotline, to shout out some information and education and just say, hey, alcohol, benzos, and muscle relaxants with cannabis can cause more drowsiness and even be, a little bit dangerous. Talking about, again, monitoring those levels of medications and maybe even switching meds or needing a different form of medication, like a second form of birth control to keep that birth control working well for them. We know elderly is one of the largest subsets coming to cannabis, if not coming back to cannabis at this time. So we talk to elders about lower and slower, not even low and slow, and same information that we share with novice people. Peter Grinspoon, a doc at Harvard, says it very well. It makes sense to try cannabis when you consider the track record of other medications a lot of older adults take, especially for pain, sleep, and anxiety. So a majority of the callers are people in their senior or their last quarter of life. So we have elders calling to help each other, to help their brother and their family members, to know what is the best dose for me, what are the medication interactions. People who've been using cannabis and been using it for a long time, but now they want to talk to somebody that has some experience and understands, because they can have the conversation now and maybe they couldn't 20 years ago. So should they be using gummies or bud or tinctures? What's the frequency? What's the resistance? Again, just a lot of callers, and within that 15 minutes, as I mentioned, believe it or not, you can get a lot of information into someone, especially in the beginning when you tell them, hey, why don't you get a paper and pen and write down a lot of what I'm going to say to you. We do dive into the science as much as is appropriate, and as much as the science we do have, definitely mentioning, as Stacy Gruber from Mind says, that this is not the cannabis people used to smoke in the 60s and 70s. So really working on consumer education, which equals consumer safety through harm reduction. So we, again, are supported by a lot of Vermonters in the adult use industry. We have cultivator support. We have cultivators sending us quotes as to they think the program is important because they recognize that there is still stigma and people are afraid to reach out to their doctors. We have Old Growth Organics telling us this is an invaluable asset in assuring that their consumers receive accurate, informed guidance, because as they said, as farmers, their expertise is cultivating, not counseling. So we're working as a community to push forward a more supported and educated consumer base, whether people are registered patients or they're coming to dispensaries as consumers, but maybe they are using medicinally in replace or in conjunction with other treatment and pharmaceuticals. People are calling for therapeutic effects. They're not calling to get high. They really want to know, what mode of administration do I use? Different cannabinoid ratios like CBD and THC, but also CBN and CBG and other non-intoxicating compounds. We talk about the best products to use. So full spectrum products. How are those made? What are the names that they're called? So when they go shopping, they understand what they're talking about and looking for. And we know that full spectrum products help reduce some of the unwanted negative side effects, as well as I mentioned before, a big part of cannabis is affording it. So getting the best bang for your buck and having the medicine that you can afford because it works most effectively for you. We talk about flower and smoking and concentrates, what the difference is, how it was grown. So continuing to educate the customer, but also making them want to dive a little bit deeper into their own healing process and understanding more to be part of their healing. We talk about strains and terpene profiles and the pros and cons as to going off the name versus how important it is to go off the lab testing that we have now, because that is a more responsible use of science and use cannabis more safely. So we go over what we call the entourage effect, which basically means for the best therapeutic effect that you want, we want you to pick the best product for you, which includes terpene analysis, which we show here. So as I keep mentioning, education really is harm reduction. We do talk about the research. We always go over safety, including children and pets and others in the home and how to keep other people safe, but we meet people where they're at. So, of course, we're not the one to encourage somebody to smoke, but if they're going to smoke, clean your pipe and understand why that is so important. So again, meeting people where they're at, but also recommending other things. Are you drinking enough water with chronic pain? Because just THC alone isn't going to take care of that. Are you getting fresh air and exercise? So looking at the holistic person, because that really is what nursing and holistic nursing is. We do talk about the difference between medical versus the recreational or adult use if they're interested. Many people want to know the locations of the dispensaries, how do they get a card, the costs associated. Again, we talk about the conversation to have with their healthcare provider regarding that, knowing that the Mayo Clinic in 2019 did show research that doctors weren't prepared to answer the questions that their patients had about medical cannabis. We go over specific products and availability so they know their options. We do talk about lab testing, the difference between the medical and adult use and the importance of lab testing. We talk about the education of staff, as I think it was Amelia that asked the question today. What is the level of staff? Who are these bud tenders and are these support people who are having the conversation and helping consumers and patients pick out their products. We know we have a lot of adult use retailers providing medical patient discounts. Higher Elevation in Morrisville, a great dispensary who's a supporter of the hotline, and we educate all their bud tenders, says that they've had over 1,300 sales discounted to medical patients, showing that that's 1,300 sales that are coming through the adult use and not the medical dispensary for people who are using medicinally with their verified medical card. So we need our bud tenders to also have this education and information. The hotline is not a prescription or a recommendation. It's education and support that we share with the bud tenders. So I am a Vermont state educator. I'm teaching bud tenders how to refer appropriately to medical professionals, to reach out to the hotline when the questions are above their scope of practice, to keep them safe legally, but also really to keep consumers safe and making the best options and choices that they can. I'm working right now to get VSAC coverage, so hopefully we'll make this class affordable to all Vermonters so that we can, moving forward, be proud of Vermont and hopefully have some of the most educated bud tenders on both the adult use and the medical dispensary side so that we can lead the way nationally. That's one of my hopes, is to really have an educated state. And the hotline is part of that. And we do feel we are helping to fill a gap that we've been noticing for years now is happening. And we are really happy to be that liaison and be that team that can offer that support and information, both to bud tenders calling, to consumers who are, not wanting to get their medical card for a reason, but also people who do have their medical card and are shopping, whether it's adult use or in the medical dispensaries. Because we have complex situations happen. I have people with POTS and EDS and Hashimoto's calling me. And these are people who've went to bud tenders, and the bud tenders don't have the education or experience or the legal prowess to make some of these not even recommendations, because I don't like to use the word recommendation, to guide and support and educate. We have people with lupus and fibromyalgia and tremors. We often nowadays are seeing more Alzheimer's and dementia patients find benefit from cannabis. And with the increase in the baby boom era and the increase in the amount of seniors who are using cannabis, we need to increase the education and the services that we are offering these consumers. So here's a quote from someone who hoped to be here today. She asked me to finish this presentation by reading it to you. It says, "I'm a 78-year-old woman getting a knee replacement. I don't want heavy drugs. She consulted with me, which she says was wonderful and incredibly helpful. She's not taking cannabis to get high, but just to relieve the pain from a knee replacement. She's heard her friends talk about recovery being pretty painful. She honestly did not know where to find out what to use if I have to use anything. And her suggestions, my suggestions, were very helpful. She says her husband's a retired physician who also agrees medical cannabis should be part of the choices that a patient can make. But without proper counseling that I help to provide, people are in the dark about what those choices are." She also wanted to mention that she facilitates workshops for physicians around the country for years and knows patients want as many options in their recovery as possible. Again, we have a lot of community support. Forbin's a dispensary in Barry tells us that it's essential. They're not doctors, but they have people coming in asking about specific issues, prescriptions, and they send them to the cannabis hotline because we can guide and aid clients and patients for their ailments and help confirm what is safe to take alongside cannabis. And then I often have messages in my inbox, or in my Instagram saying, "Hey, I love the work you're doing. Let me tell you a story. I had someone come in with a panic attack and I was able to support them. But man, if they knew about the hotline, I think they could have utilized your services and been much more supportive for this person." So again, I'm happy to fill this void. I'm appreciative, Chair Pepper, for you asking me to speak here today and sharing this information. I hope to gain more supporters to make this accessible to more Vermonters, and overall would love to see this as an option for anyone in the state of Vermont working in and using cannabis, whether a patient, a registered patient, a consumer, or some of the bud tenders who are on the front line and meeting with hundreds and thousands of people consuming cannabis. And if we can all work together to make that consumption safer and reduce some harm, well, that's, I think, why we're all here today. So thank you so much for having me and allowing me to share some of that info with you.
Yeah, Thank you, Jesse Lynn. I think you said it well, just filling the void. I mean, we're not going to just overnight have all of our kind of healthcare providers trained on cannabis, and we're not going to overnight put a pharmacist in every adult use dispensary. So there is this void, and on the adult use side, we see just kind of a drive towards more THC. That's the kind of profit motive, and really, I think education is the key to moving people away from that and thinking about some of the other lesser cannabinoids and the interactions between terpenes and cannabinoids that will hopefully move people away from just pure kind of higher THC potency. But any questions for Jesse Lynn? I think she said she's got about 4 minutes left. Julie?
I'm sorry if I missed this at the beginning, Jesse Lynn, but first of all, thank you for sharing all of this and your passion for this. Is it just you, or do you have other nurses that are partnering with you?
It's just me right now because we only offer it on Fridays. I do have another nurse ready to kind of dive in and rope in the minute this, I guess, either expands or becomes more successful. So yeah, we do have a plan in place if and when we could make it more accessible to more Vermonters.
And do you, I was struck by the portion where you were talking about collecting data on drug interactions. And while it may not be a scientific collection, like, are you collecting data, or is it just kind of information that you talk through with people?
I'm not collecting data in like a research way by any means. It's really just being able to look back at the amount of calls I've had specific to medication reactions, the amount of callers I have looking for inflammation and pain, the amount of callers I have specific to cancer. So it's definitely not, as organized as that. But if it was something that I could eventually make full time, I would absolutely be including that and love to do that.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Kyle?
Thanks. Hi, Jesslyn. Good to see you again. Just a quick question, not necessarily on the substance that you talk about, but data in terms of call volume, average call length, how many calls you're getting from the same individual who's calling to ask these questions. I mean, if we're going to think about how to scale something like this or do it from a state-supported perspective, I think a lot of that data would be really impactful for us to have. I don't know if you're collecting data along those lines right now, but it might be, moving forward, something. I know you're a small shop, aka just you, but having that information, how many callers a day or a week, average call time, even getting into the specifics of what you're talking about. I think a lot of that kind of data would go pretty far in trying to understand how valuable a resource like this could be if we could scale it.
Absolutely. I think the one thing, Kyle, to keep in mind is that I don't know how many people honestly know about the nurse hotline. The way it works right now is I have partnering adult use retail dispensaries who have rack cards, and the bud tenders understand what the hotline is and the importance of it. So it's really just those retailers. And I think there's about a dozen right now who are saying, hey, call the hotline. We haven't done a lot of advertising in newspapers. This hasn't necessarily, that I know of, been offered to the medical dispensary patients. So I do foresee, hopefully, if we have more availability and more retailers interested, we would be able to do more of a kind of market push and advertising so we have more people calling. Right now, it's specifically people referred by those dozen or so dispensaries who are working closely and partnering with us. Does that make sense?
Sure. Absolutely, and I totally recognize you're pretty word of mouth, for lack of a better phrase, right now. But even understanding where you are at that scale, I think, could be important if we could, see that data and then figure out ways, whether it's through marketing or otherwise, to figure out ways to scale those services and get people in the loop and in the know for that option being out there. That's all I had. Just if you have any data, if not, I would love to see some data.
Absolutely. I could work on it. Basically, it's just going through the calendar and seeing how many people call and where they've called from. So yeah, thank you though.
Jesse Lynn, it's 11:20. We've got one more person with a hand raised. Are you willing to stick around for one last question?
Yes, I texted my patient and told them I was running a little late. So.
Well, thank you. So Meredith, you'll get the last question for Jesse Lynn.
Hi, good morning, afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Jet. This isn't a question as much as it is a comment and a testimonial to Jesse Lynn. I can't speak more enough about how many people we give RAC cards to. Any bud tender who's gone through bud tender training, specifically, I can speak for us, knows their scope of practice. And if they are working within that, has many times in a day that we do need to use this. And it's extremely important for a business like us that we see a lot of medical patients. Again, I can't speak for everybody else, but more and more every day, they're seeking out a different kind of help and looking for people that they trust. And with a partnership with Jesse Lynn, we can do that. And I really just can't speak enough to that and the bud tender training. And I do want to say that even if my bud tenders have taken another training, I pay for them to take Jesse Lynn's too, because I want them to have the most comprehensive educational information for our client base. And anything I can do to support that with data and getting you data, I would be happy to. So anyway, thank you to Jesse Lynn and all of you for supporting medical patients and finding a better way to get them the resources needed. Thank you.
Thanks, Meredith. And thank you, Jesse Lynn. Again, you're filling a gap right now that's really critical. And you think about just, the folks that are starting this for the first time and just their physicians aren't willing to talk to them about it. Where else are they supposed to turn? So thank you for that. And I'll let you run, and we'll just be in touch about how your program can be incorporated into our recommendations if that's the direction we go.
Well, and I just want to say thank you. I appreciate you guys letting me share. And the one thing I didn't mention is how impactful and emotional this work is. The amount of people I have call and email me and just thank me and say that 15 minutes changed me and was so supportive. Or people call and say, I've been using cannabis for this long, but it hasn't helped. And I can just help tweak them a little bit. It's just been very heartwarming. So I just wanted to kind of finish and share that aspect as well. So thank you guys for having me today.
Great. Okay, so the last thing we have to do, I apologize to everyone, we've run over, but I think, there's two more charges of Act 65 that I don't think that we've fully fleshed out yet. One is the doses of active chemicals that are recommended for treatment of specific conditions or illnesses, and then just other ways that the board can recommend to improve the medical registry. And I'd like to devote, to the extent that we can, our next meeting on those two broad topics. And so, we have to do a public comment. And I'm going to try and just combine those two with the question of if anyone has any suggestions, thoughts about either people we should listen to, reports we should look at, or just kind of topics for ways to improve the registry that we would like to kind of think about for meeting number 3. Please kind of incorporate that into your public comment. We also have a email address that's specifically for this purpose. It's ccb.med@vermont.gov. And if you put just in the kind of 2-line or the subject line, stakeholder recommendations, that'll help us kind of sort through those emails and make sure that we incorporate people's feedback when we start to schedule meeting number 3. So I would like to, again, open up to public comment, just thinking about, active chemicals or compounds within cannabis and how that might be incorporated into treatment protocols, and then also other ideas for improving the medical program. And so with that, I'll just say, if you want to make a public comment about any of those or something else, please just raise your virtual hand and we'll try our best to call on you in the order that you raised your hand. And we have one person that joined by phone. It looks like we'll move to the people that joined by phone next. Is that Elon? Or Yylon?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. It's Island. Nice to meet you.
Island. Sorry. Thank you.
I just wanted to share a little bit about my support for the whole program, a little bit about myself. So I'm going to jump into it so I don't ramble too much as others may want to speak. My name is Island. I am a mother and a grandmother, and I've actually been a teacher and early educator here in Vermont for the past 30 years. I'm also a medical marijuana card holder here in Vermont as of the last 2 months. I had previously, I'll step back a little bit. I masked up as an essential worker through the pandemic and loved every second chasing those infants and toddlers. As of January last year, I was supervisor for Head Start when I got COVID, and I now have long COVID. Was diagnosed with anorexia and dropped to 85 pounds in June. And so enter medical marijuana and my actually the nurse hotline, which helped me a lot. So I can tell you a little bit about how this worked for me, because I do have some need for more education of both the medical providers and myself, and found that the nurse hotline was very helpful, and also a dispensary. In college, yes, I smoked a little bit of pot. Maybe more than a little bit at times, but I gave it up as I, got out of college and moved on. Life went on. I was a parent, teaching, so on and so forth, but I knew about it. And then at one point, before I got COVID, but not too long ago, maybe a couple years ago, I grew a plant, or actually somebody was growing hemp plants, and I started making a tea out of it. Helped me sleep. Fast forward, that was the end of that. I didn't do a whole lot with it. Fast forward to me dropping to 85 pounds with chest pain this summer. I had 2 doctors that were treating me at that point. I admitted to one doctor that I used cannabis tea at times to sleep, my primary, and I told him I gave it up because I was so sick I didn't seem I should do anything bad for me anymore. And he agreed. He said it probably wasn't good for me and I shouldn't, use that. And yet I had another doctor. I was also attending a practice. They're both MDs here in Vermont. And I shared that with him. I saw him weekly, more often actually. And he basically said, hey, if it's helping you sleep, you need some sleep. It's okay, have your tea. You know what I mean? It's up to you. It's your choice. It's not going to harm you. So from there, we moved on and I continued losing weight, lost my job. It's been awful. Lost my health insurance. Really, it's been just super traumatic. And I'm pretty much disabled at this point fully. I can barely stand upright for more than a few hours and go to bed at 6 every night since January. But I went to the dispensary feeling very embarrassed because Emma, and I'm an educator and we're not supposed to go to the dispensary, but I went anyhow because I just felt like I needed some help. I was starving to death. I don't have a sense of taste or smell, and actually it hurts to eat with COVID. It's awful. So anyhow, one of those bud tenders shared me Jessie Lynn's hotline, and I gave her a call, and she actually introduced me to the idea that I might need some CBD. So I want to point out that it was a healthy discussion that I needed to have, that there's more than just, hey, I need something stronger than my tea. The reality is I'm too frail to grow my tea anymore. I'd like to drink the tea. I prefer it. I don't like buying stuff. But I have to face facts. The cannabis, the medical marijuana that I've had that card for about a month now, maybe a little bit longer, I've now gained up to 90 pounds. And it encourages me to eat, even though it hurts to eat. It really does. It makes a difference. I sleep. And on the really bad days where my chest hurts and I'm just lying in bed all day, I don't cry all day because it is a pretty traumatic experience. So I want to support this whole program for those reasons. I do want to say that my needs in terms of a patient would be, and then some feedback after. This is a fascinating meeting, by the way. I've never knew there was such a meeting. My needs are more medical guidance. As you can tell, there's mixed messages from my medical doctors, and I suspect the one doctor who said, no, that's not a great idea, I am honest with him. I told him I'm going to keep doing it. It helps me sleep. I don't think he'd go to any of your trainings because there's a bias. It's such an emotional topic. It's like black and white. It's good and bad. His generation, it's no good. So I could be wrong about that. 15 minutes with Nurse Jesselyn is not enough. I mean, you heard her presentation. There's only so much you can really attend to in 15 minutes. I need more help, and the medical marijuana I have scheduled with them, the people there. So it's, at the dispensary. So I'm getting some, but I'd like my doctor to know about it. I would like a treatment protocol. I'd like it to be tax deductible. It's too expensive for me. I mean, I'm applying for disability. I mean, I'm all of a sudden went from that horrible thing where you have a great career to like, you're on Medicaid and you're on disability. So I think that's my only main feedback, just to be aware that I'd love for the doctors to have more training, but I suspect the training would be just to get them in the door. That's it. So anyhow, thank you all so much for hearing me out. And again, one more point. When I was in college, I tried to get high. That was the point. At this point, it's really just to be normal and function. And I of course don't drive or anything when I'm using that, but it's really just towards the afternoon. It feels terrible. It helps me out, that glass tea or whatever I use. So, thanks so much for listening.
Thank you for that. Really, really helpful perspective and some really concrete requests. So thank you. Tito?
Hey guys, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So Island's story just really resonated with me. That's hearing that is exactly why this process is so frustrating to me. Cannabis for symptom relief is so situational and experiential. And it's like we want to cram it into the current medical system where there's a certain dosage according to this and that. It's just not how it works. It's like it affects everybody differently. One person smokes this one cultivar cannabis, they might feel something, and then somebody else smokes the exact same thing and feels something different. And so this qualifying conditions conversation and a lot of these conversations just feel so misguided and so exhausting. It's like we're just cramming the circle into the square. And that's why hearing David saying that they have the actual pharmacist in the dispensaries, just, who, by the way, gets no cannabis training. I found that really fascinating. But it's like, what overkill? I mean, do they also have a surplus of pharmacists they don't know what to do with? I mean, it feels like these things are all in demand. And so you have this pharmacist there who's not using a ton of their skills. I'm sure they'd be better used somewhere else. Seems like we need this cannabis specialist idea to evolve and maybe a training program for a cannabis specialist who's there. Because the doctor, it feels so simple. It feels like every condition should apply. If it's helping you, just like she said, Island said, it's helping her sleep. Okay, maybe that's not exactly, how somebody else said it would be, but it's what's working for her. And so, it feels like we need to think about medicine and medical cannabis just completely differently than all other medication that we're used to taking, because it certainly does have an effect and it helps people. It just seems like there could be a way simpler way to approach this whole thing where the doctor simply refers you to the cannabis specialist, just like a doctor would refer you to a physical therapist. That's the first thing that pops in my head. But then you go, you see the physical therapist, and that person works with you over time. It's not a one and done process. The cannabis specialist is going to have to talk to you, get to know you, have you try something, then you come back. How did that work for you? It's an evolution. It's not just a one-time thing where like when a doctor says, take 600 milligrams of ibuprofen, and not more than 3,000 in a day. It's like it's so cut and dry, and cannabis just doesn't work that way. And it feels like we're constantly trying to make it so. Just really, really frustrating. And so that's it on that. But I do also have to say that we've at Burn Gallery really enjoyed the Jessie Lynn Nurses Hotline as well. It is incredibly helpful when we really have nothing. And just to touch on your point, Chair Pepper, was about reports and looking for reports that, unfortunately, these reports just not enough of them exist, or they're biased, or they have some other agenda. It feels like we need to question more patients and their experiences, just like Island gave, to really see, to get out of the procedure and bureaucracy of the medical system, which I just don't think works for cannabis. That's all. I feel like I could just go on forever, but thank you guys for listening, and it's a good one.
Yeah, thanks, Tito. Kevin?
Hi, James. Thank you for having me. My name's Kevin. I've been a medical patient since 2015, and I've worked in and out of the cannabis industry for many years now. I just want to reiterate what a couple of the other guests and other commenters have stated with cannabinoids and terpenes. You know, one strain that might work great for chronic pain might not do it for another person who has chronic pain. You know, when I was a patient service supervisor at one of the medical dispensaries here, that was a really hard thing to educate both the patients, but also other staff members that, you know, it's not a one fits all situation. So I think that's really one thing that we need to reconsider as we start to discuss this further. And then the other comment I wanted to make was I just wish you guys would make more of an attempt to advertise these meetings to the medical patients. There are many who either don't have emails or don't have great online access. And so for us to be able to be a part of it, it'd just be great if you could look at alternative methods to make us aware, whether that be a printed mailer sent to our addresses, or just other options. Because I'd missed the first meeting. Luckily, I was able to view it online, but I wasn't made aware of it. So that's all I wanted to say. But I really appreciate the opportunity that you guys are having for us here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, and we will do better about outreach. I should have mentioned before Island spoke, just to reiterate that, you know, we understand that there's still a stigma that attaches to cannabis usage, and we're talking about kind of private information a lot. If you do not want to kind of share your name or your personal details, just remember that this meeting is being recorded, and you can change your name, or if you can just email the board separately if you have comments that kind of implicate personal details. But I'll just keep moving down the list and just say, Dan, you're next.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, well, you know, when you guys ask for public comment about, you know, suggestions and recommendations, you know, I just want to reiterate that I really think this should be thought of, you know, cannabis as a natural plant medicine. And I understand all the pharmaceutical value, but a lot of that is completely understood. I saw that Dr. McLean had mentioned adverse effects, and I could kind of sense, you know, a little bit of bias in his energy as he suggested that and asked questions about it. And the truth is, you know, compare the adverse effects of cannabis at its worst to the adverse effects of alcohol. So, you know, if somebody is over-consuming alcohol and they get sick or they throw up, we all have an individual responsibility to take care of ourselves. And it's hard to have government tell us what we can and cannot ingest and put in our bodies and what's best for us. So I'd really like this to be looked at as a natural plant medicine. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Tito was saying. It's just like there's so much stigma that you can even from like the state's top physicians. So that's just kind of what I wanted to mention. And then in terms of Minnesota, you know, they first passed their medical program in 2014. You know, it took a while to be introduced. California goes back to 1996. So if you look in the Bay Area and San Francisco, there are top neuro specialists and people who've been working with children going through all types of rare seizure disorders. There's a ton of documented research that's been done. If you just reach out to the right experts, there is so much information out there. But I still think that you guys are probably going to overcomplicate this. And the other comment that I, you know, heard Dr. McLean make was he didn't necessarily agree that an individual's physician should just be able to prescribe them cannabis because they may not have the information. But, you know, most physicians in primary care, you know, physicians, they're not a specialist in every form of medicine. It's for them and their patient to discuss. So it's like the trust between a patient and their doctor. You know, if the doctor can prescribe any medicine, they should be able to prescribe any medicine or make a recommendation. I would think that you should allow any licensed physician in the state of Vermont to be able to prescribe medical cannabis if they think it can benefit that patient, because it's really between that doctor and that patient. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And if you do have you know, experts out in California that we should be reaching out to, I'd love to talk to them and kind of get them on, you know, help develop our record here so we can use their expertise and have it inform our program. Ivo?
Okay, so now I had a lot of questions even before we started, but then I want to say first that I didn't actually even know for Jesselyn and her hotline, and that I'm amazed and that I'm definitely going to look forward. I loved her presentation, and I definitely think that this is something that we should be looking forward to expand on. The other things here, you see, we listened to the Minnesota program. They started medical program in 2014, and now they have 40,000 patients, and they actually seem to be far ahead of Vermont in certain things. And Vermont has medical programs since 2004. I actually don't know what did we do in first 10 years that we are only now raising these questions. But I guess any time is a good time. What I would like to see, I would like to see a better research on PTSD. Particularly, we hear that 71% in Minnesota are non-military, so we don't really know what this is. I would also like to see more focus on how particular terpenes and components of cannabis work. I would also like to see an analysis of chronic pain, because chronic pain is also a very vague term that is all encompassing. And I'm medical patient in Vermont for chronic pain, and I can tell you that not every chronic pain in my question reacts the same. For example, when I have a neurologically driven pain, I found cannabis to work much better with that than if I had an arthritic driven pain. Like I still needed to get knee replaced and hip replaced, despite smoking weed. Yeah. This pain that was there was still debilitating. I was just able to suffer it less. I was able to live with this easier. Yeah, but I still needed eventually to do a joint replacement in order to be mobile. So it is not really that cannabis can help you avoid the knee replacement. Yeah, it can just help you suffer through the process a little bit better. But with certain neurological pains, like when I have pinched nerve, it works really much better, at least for me. So I think that we need to start analyzing the chronic pain, varieties of chronic pains, and analyzing which type of pain it works better than the others. Then I was kind of laughing when David from Minnesota said that at least one dispensary should be in each congressional district, because Vermont is all one congressional district. So if we have just one dispensary, that would definitely not be enough. So in Vermont, this conclusion from Minnesota would not work. And then there was this question of scientific studies. How do we actually determine which scientific study are we going to go with? Because there are so many scientific studies, and they, in terms of cannabis, they give vastly and widely different results and different predictions. And who is going to be deciding which of those studies are we going to honor and which of those studies are we not going to honor, or we rather going to discard? The Dr. McLean from Detailing, I think that he is taking a too conservative approach to this, and still focusing on adverse effects and the cannabis use disorder. And we need to do the survey of people who left the program in Vermont, because in Vermont, the people are leaving the program for various reasons, and we don't know why. Then we also have here. Yeah. I mean, what is the first thing that was approved was HIV. Why? Because HIV was approved because of the political push. I mean, this is another thing that we need to move the cannabis from the political realm to a medical realm, at least for the medical users, So HIV was first, and now we have those vague determinants which are essentially applied to about 2/3 to 3/4 of the patients, and that's chronic pain and PTSD that we don't know much about. So we have to expand the concept of qualifying conditions, and we have to do better research on that. Another thing, I think that Cannabis Control Board in Vermont should, sua sponte, decide to use cannabis as an alternative for the opioid substance disorder. Vermont has very, very high opioid substance disorder numbers, and this would be, I think, an appropriate move for the Cannabis Control Board to focus on. We know that the Department of Health and Human Services of United States now moved to remove cannabis from Schedule 1 and recommended it to be put on Schedule 3. And I haven't heard this today in our discussion here, but this is now something that's going on. And I think that this needs to make us change the approach how we treat cannabis medically. So we heard from Dr. Carla Freeman that there is just not a lot of evidence. And yes, this is something that we hear and read in the studies all over again, that there is just not a lot of evidence. So let's start building the evidence. I mean, this is something that we eventually would need to do. And I think that Vermont should be a pioneer and should actually be first to do that. And in that respect, yeah. So how to assess what illnesses and symptoms can be treated appropriately when we still don't know enough about what each strain contains, and when we still don't know enough how each of the components, active components in cannabis, work on us. So what I think is that what I would like to see is that UVM Medical Cannabis Center for Research and Education does a map, like analyze by spectrometry every single strain available on the market and list the, I would love to see that. I would love to see the profile, the chemical profile of every strain that's available, how much THC, how much A, how much delta 9, delta 8, CBD, CBNs, terpenes, so that we know really what each strain consists of. That's the first step that I think that the UVM Medical Cannabis Center for Research and Education should be really doing. We should start utilizing that bill that Biden signed in December for the additional marijuana research, and we should get federal grants for the UVM Research Center to map every single strain to get the profile, the chemical profile of terpenes and the active components in it.
Can I jump in here for a second, Ivo?
Yes.
First of all, we have that data in Vermont. We require product registration, and so we have the certificates of analysis of every strain in Vermont. I do agree that UVM will probably. Ivo, can I just say one thing quickly? Yeah. We're going on 3 hours here, and this meeting was scheduled for 2 hours. I'll let you wrap up, but we have 2 more people that need to comment, and I need to let some of the folks that are that joined go. We stayed on for almost an hour extra today.
Okay, so the database, if we already have it, it would be nice to be public and that we can all access it. So that's the one thing. And then there is the the doses of active chemicals. Well, the research for each particular chemical, I don't know if this was done, but this is also something that UVM Medical Cannabis Center should be doing. So each particular chemical should be analyzed how it works in us. And I'm volunteering to, to be a research subject if necessary. And then we can, because we already know for many illnesses how they chemically affect our brain. So now, once we know how the components of cannabis affect our brain, then we can extrapolate, how the particular strain would work and test for each particular illness. And then I think that increasing public awareness should be the CCB's priority. US use of cannabis should be communicated just as any other medication is. And that is very difficult, I know, because of the referential federal sites provide questionable and plain wrong information of cannabis effects. For example, I read on CDC, Center for Disease Control site, which is guideline site for physicians in this country. And they blatantly claim that cannabis impair motor coordination and reaction time. If you go to CDC website and look for cannabis, you will read that cannabis impairs motor coordination and reaction time. And that claim is completely opposite to my personal experience with cannabis and with my observation of my other friends who are cannabis users. Yeah, so we need to counteract that with our own state research, and this is what I think is very important, that we'll raise public awareness that federal sites do not offer proper information about cannabis because they are influenced by politics instead of medicine and science.
Okay.
So
all right. Thank you, Ivo. Yeah, I really appreciate the comments. If there's anything further that you missed, please feel free to email them to ccb.med@vermont.gov, and we'll make sure that everyone on the board gets to read them. I'm just going to move down the list to Fletcher.
Hi there. Thank you all for having these meetings. And so my name's Fletcher. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I've been a medical cannabis patient for going on 3 years now. I suffer with PTSD from my public safety career. And so I appreciate all the comments, and I just kind of like to say that I feel that in speaking with others that have had similar illnesses as me, that testimonials from patients have been very important, and I feel like that could play a very important role in creating a better avenue for folks that suffer the same kind of condition I do, mostly in the public safety world, because it's a lot of folks don't really want to speak about the symptoms associated with PTSD. And so it's kind of, it kind of goes as kind of a quiet, people don't speak about it. But I'm here to say that I've been very successful. I've had a very successful time with medical cannabis. I've gone down, I've reduced benzos with using cannabis. And I feel like the research into like Vermonters with PTSD that are experiencing these types of symptoms, cannabis is a really great tool for nightmares, is a really great tool for hypervigilance. And I feel like there's still a stigma about the usage of it. However, I'm here to say that the program has helped me immensely. I'm grateful for it, and there isn't enough scientific research, which I feel that if Vermont had, I'm not sure, but if there was a research into testimonials from patients with the same kind of illness that I suffer from, that we could probably get some good data But it's the opening up to your doctor. It's the, creating your multidisciplinary team to just be comfortable speaking with your doctor about it, and kind of just collecting that data on how it can help, and educating folks that are prone to this type of illness, what is out there that can help them. And thank you for your time, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Fletcher. I know it's not easy to talk about these kinds of issues publicly. The last on my list is LC.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, I want to I'm so proud of you guys at the CCB. I'm proud of Kyle and Julie and James for what you guys did for Vermont. I was a member of the Medical Marijuana for Symptom Relief Oversight Committee, so I truly know from whence you came. And I also want to give a big shout out to the cultivators. The products out there in the adult use market are just amazing. In fact, some of the products are also available at my dispensary. That's what one of the when I was still on the committee, before we guys set it over to you guys, we all talked about how patients want to buy local from their local dispensaries without being taxed. We don't want to go to the big conglomerates, that we would rather go to our local cultivators. And that's not happening right now as far as in my neighborhood. Another thing I'd like to talk to you about is the 3-year versus 1-year card. And I believe that's a discriminatory practice that might cause a class action suit. It could easily, so the 1 year for chronic pain, 3 years for everything else on the list. Easily my doctor would check the box, if there was a box to be checked, that my disease, which is chronic pain, is for 3 years. Let me tell you a little bit about it. First of all, it was the pain specialist at Dartmouth that recommended me to go into the medical marijuana program. I smoked pot as a young adult, but I didn't do it emphatically or, just casually. So since my pain specialist recommended it, I've been a patient since 2017. My condition is genetic. There is no cure. It involves the RNA and DNA signaling. It affects all soft tissue. It affects all organs. It includes symptoms of IBS and can also lead to glaucoma. You can easily get migraines. Some people with this disease are in feeding tubes and in wheelchairs and use mobility devices. So why isn't this a 3-year card? I don't get it. Give my doctor a choice to choose. Okay, it's very discriminatory. I have no choice. There is no cure. Cannabis is the only thing I use. I was in the past, was prescribed opioids, morphine, Oxycontin, all of that gone, not needed anymore. Cannabis is the only thing I use. It is my medicine, and I should be able to buy it in my neighborhood without being charged tax. I really appreciate you guys. And I also want to shout out to the gentleman that talked last time about the community grow that he would like to see. Community grow for patients would be a wonderful thing down the road that you guys can consider. And this is what it would entail. I am not physically able to grow my own, but if I could donate what I'm allowed to grow to somebody that has a community grow, and they could grow it for me, and that would be my access point, that would be wonderful. That's what they do in Hawaii. Let's be a little more progressive here. But I really do appreciate these meetings, and I truly appreciate, and I will testify to the Senate or the Congress about why chronic pain shouldn't be charged 3 times as much as someone with glaucoma. It doesn't make sense to me. Why should I pay $150 for a 3-year certificate card when a person with glaucoma, which my disease can cause, gets a 3-year card? It doesn't make sense. We have to change that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for your kind of continued involvement. I don't see anyone else for public comment. Again, if something comes up in between now and our next meeting that you'd like to reach out to the board about, people you'd like to hear from, experts, or information you'd like the board to consider, please just email us at ccb.med, that's MED, at vermont.gov, and we will try to do our best to accommodate as many participants when we schedule our next meeting as possible. So with that, I will adjourn this meeting. Thanks everyone for attending, and thanks for sharing your thoughts.